The elevator doors open on the 43rd floor and the air hits you first. Cigarette smoke and Chanel No. 5 and the particular stale chill of recycled office air that has been cycling through the same ductwork since 1974. The carpet beneath your heels is a deep burgundy that hides everything. The walls are panelled in dark walnut that was selected, you understand intuitively, to project gravitas, to project permanence, to suggest that whatever happens in this building has been happening for a very long time and will continue happening long after you're gone. You're 26 years old. You graduated third in your class from Wharton. You have a briefcase that cost more than your first month's rent, and you're wearing the navy blue suit your mother helped you pick out because she said it made you look serious. You spent 40 minutes this morning on your hair, not because you are vain, but because you have learned already in your first 3 weeks on this floor that there is a tax on looking too feminine, and an equal and opposite tax on not looking feminine enough, and you're still trying to calculate the precise midpoint that will let you simply be taken seriously. It is 1984. You're standing in the lobby of one of the most powerful investment banks in the world. You have just passed your Series 7. You have a salary that your father, who worked 30 years at a Pittsburgh steel mill, cannot quite believe when you tell him the number. You have everything people keep telling you. You have everything, and the only thing standing between you and more of everything is time and hard work and not making any mistakes. The floor stretches ahead of you, and it is enormous in the way that only certain spaces can be enormous, not in physical dimensions but in implication. The trading floor of a major investment bank in 1984 is one of the most concentrated collections of ambition, capital and nervous energy that the modern world produces. Every desk is a node in a network that moves money across continents in fractions of seconds. Every phone call is a transaction. Every relationship is an asset that depreciates if not maintained and appreciates if managed well. And the people who understand this at 26 are already, whether they know it or not, ahead of the people who will not understand it until 30. There are women on this floor, not many. You counted in your first week and the number is lower than you would have expected given the percentage of women in your Wharton graduating class, and the discrepancy is a data point that you filed without yet knowing what category it belonged to. The women you see are mostly at your level, analysts and junior associates, recent graduates like yourself who have arrived here on the strength of their credentials and who are navigating, as you are navigating, the space between what they were told this place would be and what it actually is. What nobody tells you, standing in that elevator lobby in your navy suit with your expensive briefcase and your Wharton degree, and your whole life arranged before you like a very well-organized spreadsheet, is the thing they are not allowed to say. The thing that exists in the space between what is written in the employee handbook and what actually happens. The thing that will not have a name for another 5 years when a woman named Felice Schwartz puts it into a Harvard Business Review article and the entire country explodes into argument about it. They called it the mommy track, and by the time you understood what it was, you were already on it. Wall Street in 1984 occupies a very particular geography in the American imagination. It is not just a set of streets in lower Manhattan. It is an idea, and the idea in the 1980s is inflating at a rate that will later seem, in retrospect, both inevitable and absurd. The leveraged buyout is in full flower. The hostile takeover has become a legitimate strategy. Michael Milken is selling junk bonds from a Beverly Hills office that is run according to principles that the rest of the industry regards with a mixture of admiration and unease. Money is being made in quantities that previous decades did not produce, and that are being written about in newspapers and will eventually be made into films. The women who enter this world in the early 1980s enter it with credentials that are, by any objective measure, equivalent to the men who enter alongside them. They come from the same schools, and they have passed the same exams, and they have the same ambitions, and they are going to discover, at different speeds and through different specific incidents, and through the accumulation of different specific data points, that the equivalence of their credentials does not produce an equivalence of their experience. This is the story of that discovery. And it begins here, in the lobby of the 43rd floor, where the carpet is burgundy and the walls are walnut and the air smells of everything that the 1980s believed about itself. You adjust your briefcase, you walk toward your desk. The day is beginning. And you do not yet know that some things have already been decided. Settle in now. Let the sounds of wherever you are fall quiet around you. This is a long story and it moves slowly. the way these things always move slowly, the way the grinding of institutional gears is never as dramatic as it looks from the outside. Pull the covers up if you have them, let the light go soft. If you enjoy listening to stories like this, subscribe. New stories go up every week, and this one will still be here when you wake. We're going back to a very specific American world. It is the world of high finance in the 1980s, and it is a world of extraordinary contradictions. The decade that produced Gordon Gekko and leveraged buyouts, and the phrase greed is good also produced quietly, a generation of women who walked into those towers and tried to build careers inside them. Some of them succeeded beyond anything their mothers had imagined possible. Most of them ran headlong, sooner or later, into a wall they had not been told was there. The Wall Street of the 1980s was a place of almost cartoonish excess. The bonuses were real, the cocaine was real, the 18-hour days were real, and the culture that demanded them was real, and the unspoken understanding that your commitment to the firm was measured in the hours you kept, and the vacations you did not take, and the personal life you were willing to set aside was perhaps the most real thing of all. Women had been entering the financial industry in meaningful numbers since the mid-1970s, propelled by Title VII, by the women's movement, by the slow and grudging opening of doors that had previously been sealed. By 1984, they made up roughly 40% of the entry-level analyst class at many major banks. They had the degrees, they had the ambition, they sat in the same training programs and passed the same licensing exams and worked the same insane hours as their male counterparts. And yet, the numbers at the top told a different story. Women held approximately 5% of vice president positions at major investment banks in the mid-1980s. They were present at the base of the pyramid in numbers that suggested genuine change, and they were nearly invisible at the top, in numbers that suggested the change had not quite reached where it needed to go. Something was happening between the bottom and the top, something that filtered women out, something that was not written in any policy document and would have been denied by any HR department. Something that operated in the texture of daily life, in the assignments you were given and the ones you were not, in the clients you were introduced to and the ones whose calls were routed elsewhere, in the way a pregnancy announcement in 1984 on the 43rd floor of a Manhattan investment bank landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading outward in ways that were invisible and permanent. This is the story of that something. It is the story of women who arrived on Wall Street during one of the most energized and reckless decades in American financial history and discovered that the rules of the game had not been written for them. It is the story of the mommy track, which is what it came to be called, though for years it had no name at all. It existed the way many institutional practices exist, not as a policy but as a pattern, not as a rule but as a series of small, deniable, cumulative decisions that added up over time to a wall. You are inside this world now. The burgundy carpet is under your feet. The walnut paneling is on the walls. The elevator has closed behind you and the trading floor is somewhere below. The sound of it a low hum that you can feel more than hear, like the vibration of a very large machine. The coffee is already brewing in the break room. Your inbox is already full. The day is about to begin. You do not know yet what is coming, but you will. The decade of the 1980s is often told as a story about men, about Gordon Gekko and Ivan Boesky and Michael Milken, and the particular quality of aggression that characterized the decade at its most visible and most extreme. This telling is not wrong. The men who dominated the headlines of 1980s finance were, in many cases, genuinely extraordinary figures, extraordinary in their appetite and their creativity, and their willingness to operate at the edge of what was permitted by law and culture. They made the decade what it was, and they made it legible to the outside world. But there is another story of the same decade, less visible and less dramatically told, which is the story of the women who entered the financial industry during those years in meaningful numbers for the first time, who worked in the same buildings and on the same deals and alongside the same extraordinary men, and who were trying to build careers in an environment that was, in ways both overt and subtle, still making up its mind about whether they belonged there. This is the story that this script tells. It is told in the second person because the second person is the closest available approximation of what it was like to be inside it. What happened to women on Wall Street in the 1980s was not unique to Wall Street. It was happening in law firms and consulting companies and corporate America more broadly. happening in every institution where women had entered in substantial numbers and were trying to rise. But Wall Street is the particular case we are inhabiting tonight, for the specific and useful reason that Wall Street measures everything, including itself, in numbers, and the numbers of women who entered at the bottom and the numbers of women who arrived at the top tell a story that the numbers themselves are very clear about. The numbers from the early 1980s are worth sitting with for a moment, because numbers are the language this world speaks, and they are more honest than the other languages available. In 1980, women make up roughly 40% of entry-level hires at the major investment banks. The number has been climbing steadily through the 1970s, propelled by a combination of anti-discrimination law, changing social norms, and the practical reality that the industry was expanding faster than the existing talent pool could accommodate, and the firms needed smart people and smart women were available. The 40% number is celebrated. It is cited in industry publications as evidence of progress. It is the number that gets said in the recruiting presentations at Wharton and Harvard and Yale, the number that persuades women like you that the path is open and that the question of whether you can get in has been answered. The number that does not appear in the recruiting presentations is the one at the other end. Women hold approximately 5% of vice president positions at major investment banks in 1984. The number has been documented by researchers and noted in the business press, and when asked about it, the firms give answers about pipelines and tenure, and the need to give the new generation of female talent time to develop. The gap between 40% at the entry level and 5% at the vice president level is not a pipeline problem in the sense of a shortage of qualified women. It is something else, something that the people who experience it will spend years trying to name and document and prove, and something that the people who benefit from it will spend years explaining as a natural consequence of individual choices, individual performances, individual fits and mismatches that add up to a pattern that is, they will say, nobody's fault in particular. This is the story you're inside. You do not know it as a story yet. You know it as a job, a career, a set of decisions about clients and deals and relationships and positioning. You know it as a series of long days and longer nights, and a salary that makes the long days and longer nights feel like a reasonable transaction. You know it as the life you chose and worked for and earned. The part that you are still discovering, the part that will take years to see clearly, is the structure of the story you're inside, the way that certain things that feel like individual events are actually part of a pattern, and the pattern has a shape, and the shape will eventually have a name. But that is later. Right now it is the autumn of 1984, and you are at your desk on the 43rd floor, and there is a Quatron terminal glowing amber in front of you, and a stack of pitch books to review, and a phone that rings more than you would have thought possible before you started working here. And the work is genuinely absorbing in the way that difficult and consequential work is absorbing. The way it fills the available space and makes the hours disappear, and makes you feel, on the good days, like you're doing exactly what you were trained to do and doing it well. On the good days, the 43rd floor is the right place to be, and the navy suit is the right thing to wear, and the briefcase that costs too much is exactly the right briefcase. On the good days, you are simply here, doing the work, and the rest of it is elsewhere. The people who designed the institutions you're entering did not design them for you. This is not a moral statement about their intentions. It is a practical description of a historical fact. The architecture of the major investment bank, its hours, its social structure, its informal networks, its assumption of what a committed professional's life looks like, was built in decades when the professional in question was presumed to have a particular domestic arrangement. A wife at home managing the household, organising the social calendar, raising the children, creating the conditions under which the professional could give himself entirely to the institution. The institution was built for a person with a wife. It was not built for someone who might herself be the wife that the system assumes. You are not the first woman to notice this. The women who entered these institutions in the mid-1970s, the first wave, noticed it and wrote about it and talked about it in the rooms where they gathered to compare notes, and some of them left and some of them stayed, and the ones who stayed made accommodations that cost things that are not always visible in the record of what they accomplished. You know some of these women. You have read what some of them have written. You're aware in your first weeks on the 43rd floor that you're inside a story that is bigger than your own story. that the decade you're entering is a specific chapter in a longer narrative that began before you and will continue after you. This awareness is useful, and it is also, at 26, somewhat abstract. The abstract awareness will become specific. It will become specific through the accumulation of specific things that happen on specific days, and the specificity is what this story is made of. Not the general pattern, but the particular instances. Not the statistics, but the Tuesday morning in the elevator, and the Thursday night at the bar, and the conversation with Martin in November, and the notebook that begins the week after that conversation. The general pattern explains why these things happen. The particular instances are what they feel like from the inside, which is the part that the statistics cannot capture. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. The trading floor of a major investment bank in 1984 is not a place that was designed with you in mind. This is not a metaphor. It is a physical fact, available in the architecture, in the sight lines, in the way the space is laid out and the way the culture has been layered into it over decades during which no other kind of person existed here at all. The floor was built by men and for men. It carries that history the way old buildings carry the smell of the people who lived in them, the smell of certain decisions made in certain rooms, the smell of who was present and who was not. You learn this early, not from any single event, but from the accumulation of small data points that a person trained in quantitative analysis cannot help but notice. The bathrooms on your end of the floor are a long walk, and when you get there, there are 3 stalls. The men's room across the hall has 6. This ratio reflects the workforce composition of a decade earlier and has not been updated. Nobody has updated it because nobody with the authority to update it has needed to use those 3 stalls. The solution to a problem that does not affect you is always slower than the solution to a problem that does. The coats in the coat closet are cut for men's shoulders. The chairs at the trading desks are built for a range of male heights and adjusted for a centre of gravity that presupposes a certain body, and when you adjust yours, it requires an Allen wrench and a specific procedure that you eventually learn to do quickly and quietly, because asking for help with it draws attention, and attention on the trading floor is not always welcome. These are not large things. They are the smallest possible things. They are the furniture of institutional life, and they tell a story about who built this room and for whom. The noise is what everyone tells you about first. Anyone who has not worked on a trading floor cannot fully anticipate the volume of it, the way it occupies the air as completely as weather, the way the sound of phones on multiple lines rings with an electronic urgency that the human nervous system processes as emergency, even when it is routine. Voices raised to carry across the room, the cadence of traders talking to clients in the clipped, accelerated language of people for whom hesitation costs money, the sound of a Reuters machine printing, the sound of paper being torn, the sound of 100 small transactions being negotiated simultaneously in a single room. You learn to work inside this sound. You find your desk and you find your chair and you adjust it with the Allen wrench, and you organize your drawer the way you organized every space you have ever inhabited, with the attention to efficiency that your mother used to call your gift, and your freshman roommate at Wharton used to call exhausting. You have a phone bank with 6 lines. You have a Quatron terminal with its amber glow that you will stare at for so many hours over the next several years that you will dream in amber. You have a legal pad and 3 sharpened pencils and a briefcase under the desk, and a small photograph of your parents that you will eventually realize is the only personal item on your desk and that you keep there deliberately, to signal nothing at all about your personal life while gesturing toward the fact that you have one. The men around you are almost universally in their late 20s to mid-40s. They are, with very few exceptions, white. They came from similar schools, though not always Wharton, and they share a vernacular that has been evolving on trading floors since the 1960s, a shorthand and a set of references and an attitude toward risk and toward money and toward one another that constitutes its own dialect. You understand most of it. You have been studying it, consciously and carefully, since your first week of business school, when you understood that fluency in the formal language of finance would not be sufficient, that there was an informal language too, and that the informal language was the one that actually ran things. What the trading floor teaches you in your first week is that competence is the entry ticket, not the destination. Everyone here is competent. The analysts who wash out do not wash out because they cannot do the math. They wash out because they cannot sustain the pace, or they cannot manage the culture, or they make some error in the complex social calculation of who you talk to and how and what you say and what you do not say. You are watching these calculations happen around you all day long, and you're making them yourself, and the fact that you have to make them while also doing the actual work of the job means that the cognitive load you carry is meaningfully higher than the cognitive load of the man at the desk next to you who does not have to make them, because the culture was built for him, and he inhabits it with the ease of someone who has always lived in a house that was designed for his dimensions. There is a woman 2 desks down from you. Her name is Catherine. She graduated from Dartmouth, and she has been at the firm for 3 years, and she has a reputation for being brilliant at fixed income analysis, a reputation that you have heard consistently and without qualification, not a hedged or softened reputation but a clean one, the kind of reputation that survives the retelling and still arrives in your ears with its original force. She arrived before you this morning. She will leave after you tonight. She has a coffee cup on her desk that says World's Okayest Employee, which is a joke. But jokes contain information about the people who make them, and this joke contains the information that Catherine has made a decision about how to occupy the space she is in, about not appearing too confident, too ambitious, too satisfied with herself in ways that would make the people around her uncomfortable, in ways they would not consciously identify, but would express through 100 small discouragements. You watch Catherine, and you begin to learn from her. This is not the education you expected to be receiving. You expected to learn about bond markets and equity analysis and client management and the mechanics of deals. You are learning those things too, and they are exactly as interesting as you expected them to be. But you are also learning the other curriculum, the one that exists in parallel, the one that has no name and is not in any training manual, the curriculum of how to exist on this floor as the thing you are, which is a woman who wants to stay and rise and be taken seriously, and who has discovered that being taken seriously is not simply a matter of performance. By the end of your first month, you have catalogued the following data points. There are 2 women at the associate level in your division, and 1 woman at the VP level, and no women at the managing director level. Both associate level women are unmarried and have, to your knowledge, no children. The 1 VP level woman, whose name is Sandra and who has been at the firm for 11 years, has a reputation for being difficult, which is a word you have begun to notice gets applied to women in situations where the same behaviour in a man would be called demanding or exacting or simply effective. Sandra never discusses her personal life. She never leaves before 8 in the evening. She never misses a client event or a review meeting or a Friday afternoon gathering of the senior team that is technically optional. She has arranged her entire visible existence so that the firm can find no complaint, no gap, no evidence of a life that competes with this one. You do not yet understand why Sandra has arranged her life this way. You are 26 and you graduated 3rd in your class, and you have not yet run into the wall that Sandra is navigating around. The wall is still somewhere ahead of you, invisible from where you're standing, unremarked upon by everyone who knows it is there and has decided, for their own reasons and in their own ways, not to point it out to the people approaching it. The floor hums, the phones ring, the amber glow of the Cotron lights your face in the morning. You are here and you are ready, and the world is very large with possibility, and you do not know yet what you are ready for. What you are ready for is the work, and the work, when it arrives, is everything you are told it would be and more. Your first assignment is supporting a senior associate named Robert on a credit analysis for a manufacturing client, and the analysis is genuinely difficult, the kind of difficulty that requires you to hold multiple complex models in your head simultaneously, and to find the places where they reveal something the client does not already know. You're good at this. You have always been good at this. The capacity to hold complexity and find its hidden logic is the deepest thing you have, deeper than the Wharton degree, deeper than the ambition, and on the days when the work is at its most demanding, you feel it running at its full power, and the feeling is extraordinary. Robert is a fair manager and a good teacher. When your analysis is good, he tells you it is good, with the specific praise that names what worked and why. When it is not good enough, he tells you that too with the same specificity. You learn from him at a pace that surprises even you. The learning has a quality of consumption, the way a fire consumes, everything going in and being transformed into something else, something that will be useful later in ways you cannot yet predict. You're good at this. You're very good at this. The floor hums around you, and the amber glows and the phones ring, and somewhere in this building, the actual machinery of American capitalism is operating at its most frenzied pace, and you're inside it, doing real work, real analysis, real thinking, contributing to real decisions that will affect real companies and the people who work in them. This is what you came here for. This is the thing that no amount of uncomfortable chairs or distant bathrooms or carefully calibrated coffee cups can undo. You are here, you are working. The rest of it, whatever it turns out to be, will have to be dealt with from inside this position, from inside the work, from inside the thing you are very good at. The thing about the trading floor that no training program prepares you for is the social ecosystem of it, the way status is performed in real time, continuously, through dozens of small signals that are invisible until you have learned to read them. Who sits where? Who speaks first in a group conversation? Whose voice drops to a lower register when they are about to say something they want people to listen to? Who gets called by first name, and who gets called by last? The ecosystem runs on these signals, and learning to read them is the prerequisite for navigating it, and navigating it is the prerequisite for everything else. You spend the first 3 months in a state of acute observation that you know, from prior experience in new environments, will eventually resolve into something more automatic. You have done this before, arrived in an environment that was not designed for you and learned to move through it fluently enough that the fluency became invisible. You did it in the first year of business school, and you did it when you moved to New York, and you will do it here. The process is familiar even when the content is new. You observe, you catalogue, you test hypotheses, you update your model of the system, you move accordingly. What is different on the trading floor from previous environments you have navigated is the speed. The environment generates new data faster than anything you have previously inhabited. By 10 in the morning on any given day, you have been in a dozen conversations that each contain information about the social landscape and its current state, about who is in favour and who is not, about what the senior people are thinking about and what they are worried about and what they want. The speed is part of the culture's design. It filters out the people who cannot process at this pace. The pace itself is a selection mechanism. By the end of your first 3 months, you have a model of the environment that is good enough to be useful, though still being refined. You understand the formal hierarchy, which is published in the org chart and which is real. You understand the informal hierarchy, which is not published anywhere and which is also real, and which diverges from the formal hierarchy in ways that matter. You understand the key relationships, who has influence over which decisions, who the senior people listen to, where the real conversations happen. You're inside the system and you are learning it, and the learning is going well. The wall is still not visible. The amber glows. The phones ring. You are here. Before the trading floor, there was the training program. Every major bank in the early 1980s ran a version of it, a compressed and intensive period during which new analysts were transformed from people with degrees into people with skills, or at least with the rudiments of skills and the vocabulary, to discuss the ones they had not yet developed. The training program is where you meet the people who will be your peers for the next several years, and it is also where you first encounter, in concentrated form, the culture you will be swimming in. The training program is an education in 2 curricula simultaneously. Only one of them is on the schedule. The summer training program at your bank runs 12 weeks. It is held in a conference room on the 22nd floor that seats 40 people in chairs that are slightly too close together, arranged in 4 rows facing a projection screen, and a whiteboard that is always slightly smudged from the previous session. The room has a view of the river, but you will have no time to look at it. The 40 analysts are sorted into 4 sections that rotate through presentations on credit analysis, equity research, fixed income, and the compliance rules that govern what you can and cannot say to clients. The presenters are mostly men with titles like Senior Vice President, who have the slightly harried energy of people who have been conscripted into teaching when what they actually want to be doing is working. Of the 40 analysts in your training cohort, 14 are women. This is a higher percentage than it would have been 5 years earlier, and lower than it will be 5 years later, and the number itself is a kind of historical coordinate, locating you precisely in the decade you're inhabiting. The decade in which the doors are visibly opening, and the question of what happens after you walk through them has not yet been fully answered by anyone's experience. You sit next to a woman named Diane on the first morning. She went to Yale and she is from Boston, and she has a kind of composed confidence that comes from having been taken seriously her entire life, which you recognize immediately and which is slightly different from your own confidence. Your confidence was assembled more deliberately, from more varied materials. Your confidence was built. Diane seems, to you, to have always been there, to have been grown alongside her rather than constructed in spite of something. You find this interesting rather than envious. You wonder what it would be like to wear confidence the way you wear a coat, as a thing that you put on without thinking about whether it fits. Diane will become your closest friend at the firm. She will also become, several years from now, the person you call when the thing you do not yet have words for happens to her first. When her voice on the phone has a quality you've never heard in it, a quality of careful control over something that is not controlled, and you will understand what she is saying before she says it, because you will have been waiting, without knowing you were waiting, for that call. The formal content of the training program is genuinely useful. You learn to read a balance sheet with the speed of someone who has been reading balance sheets for years. You learn the specific language of deal structures, the vocabulary of tranches and covenants and yield spreads that is fluent here and nowhere else. A language that sounds like English but is its own thing, carrying meanings that are precise and consequential, and that cannot be approximated with ordinary words. You learn the compliance rules, which are extensive and which you absorb with particular care, because you understand that the rules are one of the places where what is stated and what actually happens can diverge, and the divergence matters. The informal content of the training program is also useful, in a different way. You learn, for instance, that the lunch hour is not really a lunch hour but a series of social calculations about who you eat with, and what you say and what you do not say. You learn that the Thursday evening drinks at the bar 2 blocks from the office are not optional in the way that optional usually means optional. They are optional in the sense that you will not be fired for skipping them. They are not optional in the sense that skipping them has costs that are diffuse and unquantifiable, but that will show up months later in assignments not offered and clients not introduced, and a certain quality of visibility that is the prerequisite for advancement. You go to the Thursday drinks. You go every week for the entire 12 weeks of the training program. You drink 1 glass of white wine slowly over the course of 2 hours, and you talk to as many people as possible, and you are careful, exquisitely careful, about what you reveal. You do not talk about your boyfriend or your family or your weekend plans or anything that locates you in a life outside this building. You do not talk about wanting to have children someday. You do not talk about the apartment you're looking at, the neighborhood you're thinking about, the life you are constructing in parallel with this career. You have observed, already in the first weeks, that the men who talk about their personal lives are met with a kind of indulgent warmth, and the women who talk about their personal lives are met with a cooler, more evaluating attention, as though the revelation is being filed somewhere as evidence of something. This is not paranoia. You are not a paranoid person. You are a person trained in quantitative analysis who is looking at data points and identifying a pattern, and the pattern is consistent enough across enough different people in enough different contexts to take seriously. The personal lives of the male analysts establish their humanity. The personal lives of the female analysts seem to establish in the eyes of certain people a limitation. You do not understand fully why this is the case. You have hypotheses. You're testing them against new data as it arrives. By the end of the training program, you have passed all your licensing exams. You have impressed several of the senior presenters with the quality of your questions, which are specific and analytical, and which have the quality of genuine curiosity rather than performance. You have been assigned to the mergers and acquisitions group, which is where you wanted to be, which is one of the more demanding and prestigious assignments available to first-year analysts, and which feels like a confirmation of the path you set yourself on 3 years ago when you decided that this was the kind of work you wanted to do. Diane has also been assigned to M&A. You celebrate together on the last Thursday drinks of the training program, and this time you have slightly more than 1 glass of wine because you have earned something tonight, and because the path ahead looks clear, and because you are both 26 and it is a summer evening in Manhattan, and for a few hours the weight of the calculations you're making can be set down. The bar is crowded and the city is warm outside, and someone has put a song on the jukebox that will always afterward belong to this summer, to this specific moment of having finished something and not yet started something else, to the space between the training program and the actual work that begins on Monday. You're standing at the bar with Diane and 2 other women from your cohort, and the city is outside and the path is ahead, and neither of you can see, from where you are standing, what is waiting further along it. You turn back to the room. There are people to talk to. There are impressions to be made and maintained. The training is over. The real education, the one that neither of you would fully understand until you were inside it, is about to begin. You finish your drink, you put down your glass, you go back in. The training program teaches you something else too, something that none of the formal sessions address directly. It teaches you that the cohort you are part of, the 40 analysts who sit in the conference room on the 22nd floor over 12 weeks, will form a network that will matter for the rest of your career. Not just this year, not just at this firm. The people in this room will become, over the next decade, people who move to other firms and rise in those firms and who constitute the connective tissue of an industry that is small enough, at the senior levels, that everyone knows everyone. The network is forming right now, in the lunch hours and the Thursday drinks, and the late nights when subsets of the training cohort stay in the conference room after the formal sessions have ended, and talk about the industry and the economy and what they are trying to build. The formation of the network follows patterns that are already visible in the first weeks, patterns about who gravitates toward whom and on what basis, and the patterns have a structure that is not random and that you are paying attention to. You are part of the network that is forming. You are part of it actively and deliberately, because you understand what it is and why it matters, and your understanding is one of the things that distinguishes you from the analysts who are less deliberate about it. But there is a topology to the network that you cannot fully control, a way that it is organizing itself that reflects preferences and affinities that operate below the level of strategic choice, and the topology has a shape that will matter later in ways you do not fully see yet. Diane is the person you trust most in the cohort. This trust formed quickly and has been tested and has held, which is not nothing. The people you trust in environments like this one are often few, and the quality of the trust matters more than the quantity of the relationships. Diane understands what you understand about the environment, and she is honest with you in the particular way that people who share a difficult situation are honest with each other, which is differently than they are honest with people who are not in the same situation and could not quite understand it if they were told. There is a particular kind of tiredness that sets in during the 4th week of the training program. A tiredness that is not about sleep, but about the sustained effort of attention, the effort of taking in new information at the rate the training program requires and organizing it into something usable. The presentations run 6 hours a day. The reading is assigned for evenings. The informal socializing, which is not called socializing in any official material because calling it socializing would make it optional, fills the gaps. You are learning multiple things simultaneously: the technical content of the training, the cultural content of the firm, and the social mapping of the cohort. All three require different kinds of attention, and none of them can be postponed. The licensing exams fall in the 6th week of the program, the Series 7, the Series 63. You study in the evenings after the informal drinks have ended, at your kitchen table in the apartment you're sharing with a college friend in a neighborhood that is neither fashionable nor dangerous, and that suits your current budget precisely. The material is not difficult in the way that your Wharton coursework was difficult. It is difficult in the way that any large body of rule-based information is difficult to absorb on a deadline. You pass both exams on the first attempt, and the scores are good enough that they will be mentioned in your performance review at the end of the year as evidence of a quality that the review will call precision. Diane passes both exams on the first attempt also. Her scores are marginally higher than yours on the Series 7 and marginally lower on the 63. You compare notes afterward and find that you studied the same sections in different orders and arrived at the same place by different routes, which seems to you like an interesting piece of information about how minds with similar capabilities can organize the same material differently and produce equivalent results. You file this observation in the place where you file observations about how things actually work as opposed to how they are supposed to work. The training program ends on a Thursday. The final session is a presentation by the head of the M&A group, a man named Richard Carlisle, who has the specific quality of self-assurance that comes from having been correct often enough that his confidence is structural rather than performative. He is the person, you have come to understand, who will have the most direct influence on the trajectory of your career over the next several years. He is precise and unsentimental, and he has a way of asking questions during presentations that makes the presenter understand, without being told directly, exactly where the weakness in their analysis is. This is a skill. You respect it and study it carefully in the weeks after the training program ends. The hours are the first thing everyone outside the firm asks about, because the hours are the thing most legible to the outside world. the most easily communicated feature of a life in finance that has many features that resist easy communication. You work long hours. You work very long hours. This is not a complaint because you knew this when you accepted the offer letter and you made the calculation, deliberately and with full information, that the compensation and the opportunity and the credential justified the exchange. It is a fact about the texture of your daily existence, the same way the burgundy carpet is a fact and the amber glow of the Quatron is a fact, and the smell of cigarette smoke that the air conditioning does not quite remove is a fact. A standard day in the M&A group during your first year begins at 7 in the morning and ends somewhere between 10 at night and 1 in the morning, depending on where the deals you're supporting are in their various timelines. Deal timelines are not respecters of personal schedules. A client who needs a presentation revised does not need it revised on a schedule that accommodates dinner with your family, or a commitment you made 3 weeks ago to a friend, or the particular quality of exhaustion that accumulates after 11 hours of concentrated analytical work. The deal is the schedule. Everything else arranges itself around the deal. You learn to sleep on the office couch. There are 2 of them in the M&A bullpen, institutional green couches that have been there since the 1970s, and that carry in their cushions the compressed history of every analyst who has slept on them before you. You learn which angle is best for your spine. You learn to set your watch alarm for 45 minutes, which is long enough to be useful, and short enough that you can wake from it and be functional within 3 minutes. You learn to keep a spare shirt in your desk drawer and a spare pair of shoes under your desk and a small kit of toiletries in the bottom of your briefcase. Because the difference between arriving in yesterday's clothes and arriving in yesterday's clothes with clean hair and fresh makeup is the difference between a situation that is sustainable and a situation that invites concern from people whose concern is not helpful. The male analysts do these things too. Everyone in the M&A group does these things, men and women alike, and this sameness is part of what makes the experience feel, in the first year, like genuine equality. You are all exhausted together. You are all eating bad takeout from the same 3 restaurants that deliver at 11 in the evening. You are all doing the same work and making the same mistakes and learning the same lessons. In the particular democracy of the all-night deal push, the hierarchy flattens. You are just people trying to finish something. But the hours reveal something else too, something that takes longer to see and requires a wider frame to notice. The male analysts in your group go out together after late nights. Not every night, but often enough to be a pattern. There is a bar 3 blocks away that stays open until 2 in the morning, and that has a back room where, you eventually understand, deals are sometimes discussed in ways that do not quite make it into the official meeting notes. You are occasionally invited. When you are invited, you go, and it is useful, and you are part of the conversation. But there are nights when the invitation does not come, when you pack up your briefcase and put on your coat and call a car and ride home through the empty streets of Lower Manhattan, and you do not find out until the next morning that a meeting happened in that back room that was relevant to the deal you're working on. This is not a conspiracy. You have considered the conspiracy hypothesis with the same rigor you bring to everything, and you have rejected it as requiring more coordination and sustained malice than the available evidence supports. What it is, rather, is something more mundane and more difficult to address. It is the natural expression of a social preference. The men in your group feel more comfortable with each other. They have more shared references, more overlapping recreational habits, a kind of unconscious ease in each other's company that has nothing to do with your competence and everything to do with the fact that they grew up in a world that was built for them, and they are now inhabiting institutions that were built for them, and you are the new variable in the system, and the system accommodates new variables slowly and imperfectly and without particular hurry. The hours reveal the structure of the informal network, and the informal network is where the actual decisions are made. The formal decision, the one that appears in the memo and gets signed off by the managing director, is the confirmation of a decision that was already made somewhere else, in a car on the way to the airport, or at the bar with the back room, or at a golf club in Connecticut, on a Saturday morning when you are asleep or working, or spending time with the people in your life who are not at this firm. The informal network is real, and it is consequential, and its access points are not distributed equally. You begin to make adjustments. You stay later on the nights when the group is staying late together, so that you are present when the informal conversations happen. You develop the habit of walking to a senior person's office, rather than calling, so that you're physically visible more often. You cultivate a rotation of lunch invitations so that you're maintaining the necessary relationships through the mechanisms available to you. You develop these adjustments with the same systematic attention you bring to your analytical work. You are efficient about them. You are disciplined. You are doing everything right. The hours teach you that doing everything right is necessary but not sufficient. This is a complicated lesson to absorb when you are 26 and have spent your entire life in institutions where doing everything right was sufficient. School rewarded doing everything right. The licensing exams rewarded doing everything right. The institutions you had belonged to had all professed themselves meritocracies, and a meritocracy, you had understood, rewarded doing everything right. What you are learning, slowly, imperfectly, through the evidence of 100 small observations, is that the meritocracy is real in some respects and fictional in others, and the parts where it is fictional are not randomly distributed. They cluster around certain kinds of people for whom the informal network is less accessible, people who, for reasons that are structural rather than personal, cannot be fully present in all the places where the actual decisions are made. The hours are equal. You put in the same hours as the men around you. The access is not equal. You're still learning to see this clearly, and the learning is slow, because the system has no interest in teaching it to you, and every interest in appearing neutral. Catherine, 2 desks down, has a different relationship to the hours. She's been here 3 years, and she has solved the problem of the hours in her own way, which is to have no visible life outside them. You learn this gradually, through the accumulation of small evidence. She's always there when you arrive and always there when you leave. She has never, in your presence, mentioned a weekend plan or a personal commitment or a relationship. Her existence, as far as the office is concerned, is entirely the office. You think about this. You think about whether this is a solution you could adopt and whether it is a solution you would want to adopt, and what it would mean to adopt it, and the thinking does not lead anywhere comfortable. Your boyfriend, whom you will eventually marry, is also working very hard. He is a lawyer, and his hours are long too, and you are both in the business of prioritizing the career, because you both understand that the early years are the years that set the trajectory, and the trajectory set in the early years is difficult to change later. You see each other on weekends and sometimes on weeknights, when neither of you has to work past 9. You have a life together that is compressed into the hours the careers leave available, and the life is real and it is good. And it also requires the constant management of a very full calendar, and the management itself is its own kind of work, the kind that does not appear anywhere in either of your job descriptions. Outside the window of the office at 11 at night, the city is doing what it does, which is to continue without pausing. Lights in other towers where other people are also working late. A taxi on the street below, visible in brief moving yellow. The river, out there somewhere, dark and steady. You have more to do. You put your head down. You do more. There is a particular quality to the exhaustion that accumulates in the M&A group over time, a quality that is different from simple physical tiredness, and that the people who experience it recognize as specific to this work and this culture. It is the exhaustion of sustained performance under conditions of high stakes and high visibility, of always being on, of never quite being able to set down the awareness of what you are doing and who can see you doing it, and what conclusions they are drawing. This is the background condition of your professional life, and it operates continuously, even when the immediate work pressure is lower, even on the weeks when the deals are in a quieter phase and the hours are merely long rather than extraordinary. The men around you experience the exhaustion differently. They experience the work pressure and the long hours and the intensity of the deal environment. But the background condition of sustained performance under scrutiny is not their background condition in the same way. They are being evaluated, certainly, but they are being evaluated against a standard that was built to measure people like them, and the evaluation has a kind of efficiency for them that it does not have for you. They are not also simultaneously calculating how their appearance reads and how their voice registers, and whether the fact that they have a personal life should be visible, and in what proportion. The work is exhausting for everyone. The extra layer of the work is yours. You have not talked to anyone at the firm about this extra layer. Not Robert, not Catherine, not even Diane, though Diane knows it is there because she carries the same layer, and the presence of it is visible to anyone who is carrying the same weight. You do not talk about it because talking about it is one of the things that the culture does not accommodate, that would be received in the way that any complaint about the conditions of employment is received in an environment where the conditions of employment are understood to be part of what you accepted when you took the job. The exhaustion is part of the job, the extra layer is also part of the job, and the fact that it is distributed unequally is a fact that the culture has no mechanism for acknowledging. The hours are the most visible part of this life and therefore the most discussed, the thing that people who have never done the work reach for first when they try to understand what it is like. 70 hours a week is the number most often cited. 70 hours is a real number in the sense that it is the floor rather than the ceiling, the number below which most weeks do not fall. There are weeks that are 90 hours. There are stretches around deal closings that are longer than that. The hours accumulate in ways that change the texture of time. The way that Tuesday feels like Saturday feels like Thursday. The way that your sense of temporal sequence loosens. And the only structure left is the structure of the work itself, the deal phases and the deadlines and the client calls that anchor the week. The question of who keeps which hours is more complicated than the total number suggests. Everyone on the floor works long hours. The distribution of when those hours happen and what they are used for is not uniform. The male analysts in your cohort tend to accumulate their social capital, the network building, the informal relationship development, the access to the conversations that happen after hours, during the late evenings in bars and the weekend dinners that are professional events wearing personal event clothing. You are present at some of these, you're not present at all of them. The ones you're not present at are not officially important, they are also not unimportant. The information that flows in them flows imperfectly into the office on Monday morning, and the imperfection of the flow is itself a form of disadvantage that is difficult to name and impossible to measure precisely. Diane identifies the bar with the back room in your third week on the floor. It is not literally a back room in the sense of a private club or a restricted space. It is a particular table in a particular bar 2 blocks from the office, where a subset of the senior associates and junior vice presidents from your group go on Thursday nights after the formal drinks are over, the ones that everyone attends, and the informal ones that follow, the ones that are the real meeting. Diane has made it to the table twice. You have made it once. The conversation at the table is different from the conversation at the bar. The conversation at the table is where the actual assessments happen, where the deals being worked on are discussed with the specificity that is not appropriate for the wider floor, where the informal decisions about who is developing well and who is not are made in the language of casual observation rather than formal evaluation. The cognitive load of the environment is something you think about often, more often than you expected before you were inside it. The technical work, the models, the analysis, the documentation, has its own cognitive weight, and the weight is real and is the weight you prepared for and that you manage well. But there is an additional cognitive load that the technical work does not prepare you for, and it is the load of constant environmental awareness, the part of your attention that is always running a background process about how you are being perceived, and what you have said, and what you have not said, and whether the signals you are sending are being received as you intend them, or are being filtered through a set of assumptions you cannot fully see. The background process is continuous. It runs in parallel with everything else. It is tiring in a way that the technical work is not tiring, because the technical work has a product, and the product is visible and the visibility is a form of relief. The background process has no product. It has only ongoing maintenance costs. There is a book that circulates among women entering finance and law and consulting in the early 1980s. It is called Dress for Success, and it has a companion volume specifically for women, and the advice they contain is both genuinely useful and revealing in ways the authors perhaps did not intend. The advice is useful because the signaling function of clothing in professional environments is real, and navigating it badly has real costs. It is revealing because the care and specificity of the advice, the number of pages devoted to the precise width of a lapel and the correct heel height, and the inadvisability of anything resembling a ruffle, exposes how many landmines are embedded in the simple act of getting dressed for work when you're a woman trying to be taken seriously in a world that was not built for you. You have read the book. You have applied its advice with the same analytical rigor you apply to everything. Your wardrobe for the office consists of 4 navy suits, 2 grey suits, 1 charcoal suit for meetings with very senior clients, and a rotation of blouses in colours that are visible without being assertive. You own the right shoes, low enough to be professional and high enough to be visible, which is a narrower range than it sounds. You have the right briefcase, A good one, expensive enough to signal competence but not so distinctive as to draw attention. You have the right watch, which was a graduation present from your parents and which cost them more than they told you it cost. You have read the chapter on jewellery twice and applied its recommendations cautiously. The suit is a kind of argument. It argues that you are serious, that you understand the grammar of this environment and have chosen to speak it fluently. The argument needs to be made without being visible as an argument, which is the particular difficulty of the whole enterprise. If you are dressed in a way that seems too studied, too deliberate, it draws attention to the effort, which draws attention to the fact that the fluency does not come naturally. If you're dressed in a way that is careless, the carelessness reads differently on a woman's body than on a man's, and the reading is not favourable. The men around you do not make this calculation. A man in finance in the early 1980s has a relatively simple uniform that was established decades ago and that accommodates enough variation to express personality without violating norms. His clothing does not have to argue for his seriousness because his seriousness is presumed. The suit on his body is simply a suit. The suit on your body is a position statement, and the position it is taking is one that should not need to be taken, and the fact that it needs to be taken anyway is one of the 1,000 small frictions of your daily existence that you absorb and metabolize and do not discuss. You have conversations about this with the other women in your cohort, not loudly, not in spaces where men could overhear. In the particular intimacy that develops between women in male-dominated environments, the intimacy of people who share a specific and invisible difficulty, and who can only discuss it fully among themselves, because discussing it with men tends to go wrong in one of two predictable ways. Either the men deny that the difficulty exists, because they do not experience it and their own experience is the only reference they have, or they acknowledge it in a way that is somehow worse, that is sympathetic but that positions them as observers of your problem, rather than as people who exist within the same system and might have some relationship to it. Catherine, 2 desks down, has solved the uniform problem with an elegance that you admire and study. Her suits are slightly more expensive than yours, and cut with a more minimal line, a solution that reads as authority rather than femininity, while being unmistakably professional. The distinction matters. Femininity on a trading floor in 1984 is a signal that interferes with other signals, that introduces noise into the reading of your competence. Authority reads clean. Catherine has solved for authority. Diane's solution involves a consistent palette of grey and cream that has a particular East Coast gravitas, an old money restraint that says I've been in rooms like this before and I belong in them. Diane's family is from a social class that gives her access to this signal in a way that has nothing to do with the training program. Sandra, the VP, wears almost exclusively black. You have thought about this and concluded that Sandra's black is a different kind of solution, the removal of the possibility of misreading by removing everything that could be misread. Black is neutral, black is professional, black says nothing except, I am here to work. There is a woman named Patricia who joins the firm in your second year and who has not yet solved the problem. She wears colours that are slightly too saturated and heels that are slightly too high, and a perfume that is slightly too present in the particular way that calls attention to the body rather than the mind, and you watch the way she registers on the floor, the quality of attention that gathers around her, and which is not the kind of attention she wants if she wants what you want. You would like to tell her something. You do not know how to tell her without it sounding like you are enforcing, on her behalf, a system you did not design and do not endorse. You tell her nothing. She figures it out herself over the course of 6 months, in the same iterative and private way that all of you have figured things out. The uniform extends beyond clothing. It includes the way you speak, the pace and register of your voice, the degree to which you allow uncertainty to be audible in the way you present information. On a trading floor and in a deal room, certainty is the register of power, and power is performed consistently in speech, in posture, in the speed of response and the completeness of answers. The men around you perform certainty with what looks like effortlessness. You perform it with effort and make the effort invisible, which is its own kind of skill, a skill that consumes real resources and that never appears on any performance review under any category. By your second year, you have internalized the uniform to the degree that it no longer requires conscious thought. The navy suit in the morning is automatic. The blouse selection takes 30 seconds. The briefcase is packed the night before, The appearance is maintained through a system of dry cleaning and backup options and small rituals that operate in the background of your getting dressed life, the way other background processes operate in the background of any complex system, effective but expensive, always running, always. What the uniform teaches you, over time, is that you are always performing in a way that your male colleagues are not. This is not victimhood. You do not experience it as victimhood. You are someone who is genuinely good at performance, and who has reasonable tolerance for the labour that performance requires. But it does mean that you are spending cognitive and emotional resources on a dimension of your work that does not appear in your job description, and for which you receive no credit in any performance review. You are running 2 jobs simultaneously. One of them has a salary, one of them is entirely off the books. The suits hang in your closet at home in their row, ordered by colour from darkest to lightest. Navy, charcoal, grey. They smell faintly of the office, of the recycled air, and the cigarette smoke that drifts over from the trading floor, and the particular chemistry of a building that holds thousands of people, and their various efforts and ambitions and anxieties. You get them dry cleaned every 2 weeks. You pick them up on Saturday mornings from the Korean dry cleaner 2 blocks from your apartment, who has learned your name and always has your order ready, and who once asked, carefully, whether you liked your work, and you said yes without hesitation, because it was true, and because the complications of liking your work while also finding it difficult in ways that are difficult to explain are not the kind of thing that translates into that particular conversation. Monday morning comes, you choose the Navy. You're out the door by 6:45. The city is still grey at the edges. The subway smells of coffee and metal, and the day not yet started. You surface at the base of the building and look up, and the tower is already lit on the upper floors, already occupied by people who got there before you, and this is a fact about the culture you're in, and you register it as a fact and you go inside. The book's advice about jewellery is specific and somewhat anxious, which tells you something about the period you are inhabiting. No earrings larger than a quarter, no necklaces that move when you move, no bracelets that make sound. The advice is aimed at eliminating any element of your appearance that draws attention to the fact that you have a body, that produces sensation in the observer beyond the clean cognition of professional competence. The ideal professional appearance for a woman in 1984, according to the book, is one that reads as competent and serious while producing minimal awareness of gender, which is a difficult optimization given that the awareness of gender is not something you can eliminate by choosing the right earrings. You make peace with this over time. The optimization has no perfect solution, and therefore it requires accepting imperfection, which is a category of situation you are comfortable with from your work on deal modelling, where the perfect model does not exist, and the useful model is the one that is good enough for the decision at hand. Your appearance is good enough. It serves the purposes it is required to serve. The energy you spend on it is not wasted, but it is also not nothing, and the consciousness of it being not nothing is its own low-grade cost. Present in the background the way the sound of the floor is present in the background, so constant that you stop hearing it as a separate thing, and it becomes part of what being here feels like. The dress for success phenomenon is worth understanding in its specific historical context, because context is everything with this particular cultural moment. The book, written by John Malloy and published in 1977, is not simply a style guide. It is a self-help manual for women trying to navigate a world that was not designed for them, and it approaches the problem with the earnest pragmatism of someone who has done actual research into what corporate culture responds to and is trying to translate that research into actionable advice. Malloy interviewed hiring managers and executives. He observed what women wore to job interviews and tracked whether they got the jobs. He was trying to solve a real problem with empirical methods, which is a reasonable thing to do, and the book's premise, that appearance communicates information, and that the information your appearance communicates can be managed, is not wrong. What the book gets right is that clothing is a language, and like all languages, it has a grammar that the speaker can learn. What the book gets complicated is the implication that learning this grammar will level a playing field that is tilted for reasons that have nothing to do with clothing. The women on the 43rd floor who have read Dress for Success, and who are wearing the recommended navy suits, and the recommended silk blouses and the recommended low heels, have learned the grammar correctly. What they are discovering, at varying rates, is that speaking the language of the environment does not automatically make you a native speaker in the eyes of the people who consider themselves native speakers. There is always another layer, there is always something else that is not in the book. You think about this on a Tuesday in November when you're in the elevator with Patricia from Equity Research. Patricia has been at the firm for 3 years. She's 30, and she's good at her job in a way that is not in question by anyone who has worked with her, and she is still an associate at a point when her male peers with equivalent tenure are starting to be discussed for vice president. Patricia is wearing exactly the right suit. Her briefcase is exactly the right briefcase. She has done everything the book says to do, and several things the book did not think to say, and she is where she is, and you are watching her, and you're thinking about what that means for the calculation you are still in the middle of making. The calculation has several variables. How much of the gap is individual performance? How much is timing, which deals you are on, and which ones fell through for reasons that had nothing to do with you? How much is the structural factor that Patricia represents, the factor that is real but that exists in a space where it is very difficult to point to a single thing and say this, specifically, is the problem? The Navy suit addresses some of the variables. The Navy suit is not wrong. The Navy suit is just not sufficient, and insufficient is a different category from wrong, and the difference matters for how you think about what else you need to do. The work itself is extraordinary. This is the thing that gets lost sometimes in the telling of stories about workplace difficulty, the way the legitimate complexity of a situation can crowd out the genuine quality of the experience that the complexity is embedded in. The work in the mergers and acquisitions group in the mid-1980s is some of the most interesting work in American business, and you know this while you are doing it, and the knowledge is a sustaining thing, a counterweight to everything else. A merger is a negotiation between two companies about the terms on which they will become one company. This description is so spare as to be almost comic in its understatement. A merger, when you are inside it, is a living organism. It has its own logic and its own momentum and its own crises, which arrive on schedules that cannot be fully anticipated and that require responses that cannot be fully planned in advance. It involves lawyers and accountants and bankers and regulators and boards of directors and shareholders, and sometimes governments and occasionally the press, and all of these parties have interests that partially align and partially conflict, and the work of the banker is to understand those interests and the relationships between them with enough precision to construct and maintain the conditions under which a deal can happen. Your first deal is the acquisition of a regional manufacturing company in Ohio by a larger competitor. The deal is not large by the standards of a decade that has already seen transactions that dwarf it, but it is a real deal with real stakes and real clients, and you are genuinely part of the team that works on it. Not the whole team, not the senior part of the team. But your analysis is incorporated into the presentation that goes to the board of the acquiring company. Your spreadsheet models form part of the basis on which a major corporate decision will be made. The work you do will be inside the deal when the deal closes, part of its permanent architecture. You work on the financial model for 3 weeks. You build it in Lotus 1, 2, 3 on a PC that the group recently acquired, and that is already changing the speed at which this kind of analysis can be done, compressing into hours' work that would have taken days on the adding machines and paper ledgers of a decade earlier. The model projects 5 years of combined financials under a range of assumptions, synergy cases, integration cost scenarios, different structures for the consideration offered to the target's shareholders. You build it with the care of someone who understands that the numbers in this model will be used to justify a decision that will affect thousands of people who work for both companies and who will not see the model and do not know it exists. Robert reviews the model with you on a Thursday afternoon, going through it line by line, asking questions about your assumptions and occasionally suggesting different ways to structure the analysis. The review takes 3 hours. You push back on 2 of his suggestions, politely but substantively, with reasons, and he accepts your reasoning on one of them and overrules you on the other, with a counter-argument that you find, when you think about it carefully, to be correct. This exchange is one of the best 30 minutes of your professional life to date. You are being engaged as an analyst. Your thinking is being taken seriously as thinking. The quality of the work is the thing being evaluated, and the quality is sufficient. The negotiation itself is something you observe more than participate in this first deal. You're in the room for some of the conversations, taking notes, providing numbers when numbers are requested, available to run back to your desk and update a model when a new scenario needs to be analysed on short notice. You watch how Robert manages the client relationship, the particular combination of warmth and authority that a skilled senior banker maintains, the way he controls the pace and direction of a negotiation without appearing to be controlling it. You are learning this from close range, and you are absorbing it at the level of instinct, below the level of conscious instruction. The deal closes on a Tuesday in February. You do not sleep the night before, not because anything goes wrong, but because deal closings generate a particular kind of alert energy that makes sleep beside the point. Documents are being signed in multiple locations simultaneously. Funds are being transferred through the systems that moved money in 1985, which are slower than what they will become, but which carry the same quality of finality. Regulatory filings are being confirmed. At 3 a.m, you're in the office with Robert and 2 associates and 4 lawyers, working through a closing checklist item by item. And when the last item is confirmed at 4:47 in the morning, there is a brief quiet moment in which everyone in the room knows that something real has been accomplished. Then everyone goes back to work because there is a closing dinner to plan, and a client to call when the market opens, and a press release to review. You go home on the subway as the sun is coming up over Queens. The car is nearly empty, just a man with a newspaper and a woman with a cart of cleaning supplies heading to work. You are in your navy suit that you have been wearing for 31 hours, and you are carrying your briefcase, and you have that particular quality of exhaustion and clarity that follows a completed thing. The deal is done. The analysis you built is inside it now. The model you made in Lotus 123 over 3 weeks is part of a transaction that will appear in the business press this morning, and that will be discussed in board meetings and shareholder reports and in the lives of thousands of people who will never know your name. You rest your head against the window. The tunnel lights flicker past in their rhythmic sequence. You're 27 years old, and you have just closed your first deal, and the feeling in your chest is not exactly pride, though pride is part of it. It is something more like confirmation that the work you came here to do is as real and as consequential and as genuinely interesting as you believed it would be. Confirmation that the calculation you made, accepting the long hours and the difficult culture and the various frictions of being a new kind of person in a very old kind of place, was a calculation that was worth making. What you do not know, looking out at the tunnel lights, is that 3 years from now you will announce your pregnancy to your division head, in a meeting that you will prepare for with the same care that you prepared for this closing, and that something in the room will shift in a way that you will spend years afterward trying to fully describe. You do not know about the Anderson deal, which does not exist yet, and which will exist by the time you need to know about it, and which will be given to someone else in a way that will have a deniable explanation. You do not know about the Carlyle client, who is a person you have not yet met, and who will become genuinely important to you, and who will, after your announcement, gradually begin routing his calls through a colleague named David. You know none of this in the subway car in the morning light. The train surfaces above ground. Queens is doing its early morning thing, the streets emptying and filling with the first shifts of workers, the sky that particular pale gold of early morning light that does not last long, and that is one of the specific privileges of being awake at this hour. Your son is not born yet. He does not exist yet. The notebook is not yet started. The pattern is not yet visible. You're 27 years old and you're very tired, and you have just closed your first deal, and the future is still ahead of you, vast and unread, full of the particular promise that the morning holds for someone who has not yet learned what it is going to cost. The deals accumulate over your first 3 years. Each one adds to the model you are building of how these transactions work, how the parties think, how the negotiation unfolds, where the real obstacles are and what moves them. By the end of your second year, you've worked on 11 transactions in various capacities, and you have a feel for the work that is qualitatively different from the feel you had when you were building your first model in Lotus 123 with Robert looking over your shoulder. The difference is the difference between knowing the rules of a game and understanding why the rules are the rules. Robert tells you, at your second year review, that you are one of the 2 strongest analysts in the group at your level. He says this with the directness that characterizes his better qualities as a manager. He also says, with the same directness, that he is going to recommend you for early consideration for associate. Early consideration means 6 months ahead of the normal timeline, a specific and measurable recognition of performance that has a clear professional implication. You go home from that meeting and you call your mother and she says quietly, "Very good." 2 words. The same 2 words she said when you were accepted to Wharton. They carry the same weight. The work of M&A is relationship work as much as it is analytical work, and the relationship dimension of it is one that you have been developing with the same deliberateness that you brought to the analytical dimension. By your 3rd year, you have genuine relationships with clients that have been built through the specific accumulation of reliable competence and genuine attention, and the particular kind of trust that is created when someone knows you will tell them the true thing even when the true thing is not the thing they want to hear. These relationships feel like the thing that all the preparation was in service of. They feel like what it was supposed to feel like when you arrived. The M&A deal that closes in the spring of your 2nd year is a mid-size acquisition, a regional manufacturer being absorbed by a larger conglomerate, and the process of getting from the initial mandate to the closing dinner takes 8 months of the most concentrated work you have done in your professional life. The financial model at the center of the deal is one you built. You built it over 6 weeks of evenings and weekends, iterating through assumptions with the client's CFO in phone calls that sometimes ran till midnight, stress testing scenarios that Richard Carlisle had asked about in ways that were phrased as questions, but were actually instructions about what he needed to see in the model before he would be comfortable presenting it to the board. The model is good. You know it is good, not because you are easily satisfied with your own work, you're not, but because the deal closes on the terms the model predicted, and because the CFO, who is a careful and experienced man who does not offer compliments unnecessarily, sends you a note afterward that says the model was the best he had seen in 20 years of transactions. You keep the note. You put it in the folder where you keep documentation of things that are concrete and verifiable, things that exist in the physical world and that cannot be revised by anyone's later recollection of what happened. The folder is not yet the notebook. The notebook is later. The folder is simply the accumulation of evidence that you are doing the work you are hired to do, and doing it at the level the work requires. You're not yet, in the spring of your 2nd year, thinking about the folder as evidence for anything other than your own performance review. You're thinking about the next deal. You're thinking about the relationship with the CFO, who mentioned in his note that there would be future transactions and that he hoped you would be involved in them. You're thinking about the conversation with Richard Carlisle, in which he reviewed the closing and used the word excellent, without the qualifications that sometimes accompany his use of that word. The late nights are real, and they are numerous, and they have a texture that you will remember later when people ask what the work was actually like. You remember the specific quality of the air in the office at 2 a.m, the way it feels different from the office at 9 a.m, not cooler exactly, but emptier, in a way that changes the quality of attention available, the way that silence changes the way sound carries. You remember the particular fluorescent hum of the overhead lights in the long corridors between the conference rooms where the deal team worked and the floor where your desk was. You remember the coffee from the machine in the break room that was available at all hours and that was reliably bad and that you drank anyway because the alternative was the alternative. These are the details that do not make it into the official account of what the work was, but they are what the work was. The client is always the argument. When the question of gender surfaces in a conversation about deal assignments or meeting attendance or which banker gets introduced first, the answer from the people who make those decisions is almost always framed in terms of the client. What the client expects, what the client's culture will accommodate, what the client's comfort level requires. The client becomes a screen onto which any number of institutional preferences can be projected, a way of locating the source of a decision outside the person making it, in the preferences of an absent third party who cannot be interrogated. You understand fairly early how this works. You observe it first in the way introductions are managed at client meetings, who is introduced first, whose name appears at the top of the email chain, who is asked a question when the question could be directed at any of 3 people in the room. You observe it in the way certain client calls are routed, in who gets copied on what, in the specific social geography of who sits where at a closing dinner, and what those positions signal about the relationships being performed. These are small observations. None of them individually constitutes evidence of anything. Together, over months, they form a pattern with a consistent direction. The clients of a major investment bank in the 1980s are almost entirely men. The CEOs and CFOs and boards of directors whose companies are being acquired or financed, or taken public, are men, with exceptions so rare they are treated as worth noting. These men come from a particular generation, many of them from the post-war boom years, and they carry with them the assumptions of that generation about who belongs in certain rooms and what authority looks like when it speaks, and how competence is signalled by the body of the person who possesses it. Some of these men are fine, more than fine. There are clients who evaluate the quality of the work and the quality of the thinking, and are genuinely indifferent to the gender of the person producing it. Clients who direct their questions to you, because you are the one who knows the answer, and who introduce you to their counterparts, because you are the one they want to vouch for. These clients exist, and they are not rare, and you value them with a specific gratitude that you maintain carefully because it is information about the landscape, information about what is possible and what the problem is, therefore not. But some of the clients are not fine, or not fine in ways that create friction that everyone in the room can feel and that nobody quite addresses. There is the client who directs his questions to Robert even when you have answered them twice, who seems to be looking for a confirmation from the male voice that the female voice has already provided. There is the client who makes a joke at the closing dinner that is calibrated to exclude you from the room in some fundamental way, a joke whose punchline only works if you're not considered fully present, and that the other men at the table receive with the slightly uncomfortable laughter of people who know the joke is wrong but also know that the client is the client. There is the client who cannot remember your name despite 3 meetings, whose difficulty with your name is not malicious, but is the expression of something real, something about who he expected to see in this room. Robert handles these situations with a skill you come to deeply respect, a skill that you watch and study the way you watched and studied everything in this environment. He does not confront. He does not apologize on behalf of the client. He simply, efficiently redirects. He asks you a question in front of the client in a way that positions you as the authority on the specific thing being discussed. He references your work in a way that makes its quality visible without making the act of making it visible. He does these things without announcing them, without making a speech about them, just managing the room in the way that a skilled banker manages rooms, which is to keep the deal moving and keep everyone comfortable, while also creating the conditions under which the people who need to do the work can do it. You wonder sometimes if Robert is aware of what he is doing, whether these are conscious choices or simply his natural manner, the expression of a genuine fairness that he does not particularly theorize. You do not ask him. The question feels too exposing. There is a particular loneliness to this, to doing your work surrounded by people who are largely well-meaning and who are also operating within a system they have never had reason to fully see, and who therefore cannot quite be asked for the help that would require seeing it. There are client events at golf clubs in Connecticut. You play golf. You learned specifically because you understood it would be necessary. You play reasonably well, well enough not to embarrass yourself or your firm, which is the relevant threshold. But the golf club in Connecticut on a Saturday morning is a different kind of space than the conference room on the 43rd floor, and the conversations that happen on the third fairway have a different character than the ones that happen across a conference table. The informality of the golf course is a social lubricant for some people, and a social complication for others, and you are among the others, present but slightly effortful, maintaining the ease of someone who belongs there while being someone who has had to learn, deliberately, how to belong. Diane is better at this than you. She has a quality of warmth in social situations that registers as natural rather than calculated, and clients respond to it. Male clients who might have been tepid about working with a woman finding themselves genuinely at ease with her. This is not a performance. It is simply a quality she has, a capacity to be interested in people in a way that they can feel, and it serves her well in the particular ecosystem of relationship-based banking, where the quality of the relationship is itself part of the product. You work on this. You get better at it. You discover that the genuine interest, the real curiosity about people, and what makes them tick and what they are trying to accomplish and what they are afraid of, is not separate from the analytical disposition you already have. People are complex systems. What motivates a CFO, what makes a board anxious, what a CEO is trying to protect are all analytically interesting questions, and when you approach them with genuine curiosity rather than transactional attention, the relationships begin to feel different. They begin to feel real in a way that is not just professionally useful but actually satisfying. By your 3rd year, you have client relationships that are genuinely yours. Clients who call you directly. Clients who ask for you specifically when a new situation arises. clients who refer you to colleagues with warmth and specificity. One of them, a CFO named Thomas at a company called Carlyle Industries, calls you every few months even when there is no active deal, simply to talk through something he's thinking about, to use you as a sounding board in the way that people use bankers they trust. This relationship feels like what it was supposed to feel like. It feels like the reward for the years of careful relationship building, for the golf, and the careful conversations and the genuine attention to what clients actually need. The pattern you observed in the early months is still present. The small frictions have not disappeared, but you have found ways to work around them through the relationships you have built and the performance record you have accumulated and the specific visibility you have created through your own client work. The forward motion feels real. You are here, and you are doing the work, and the work is being recognized in the ways that matter. You do not yet know what you do not yet know. The wall is still ahead. But from where you stand in your third year, the path is wide and the light is good, and the future is full of Carlyle clients who call you because they want to. The client relationship has a specific texture when it is working well. You can feel it in the quality of the conversations, which become more efficient and more direct as the relationship deepens, less time spent on the preliminary assurances and more time on the actual substance. A client who trusts you says what they are actually worried about, rather than what they think they should be worried about. The gap between those two things is often where the most useful work happens. Thomas at Carlyle is this kind of client. He calls you on a Tuesday afternoon to talk through something that is, technically, outside the scope of any active mandate, simply a thing he is thinking about, a market development that he wants to understand better, a strategic question that has not yet become a transaction, but that might become one. He is using you as a thinking partner, which is a different relationship from client and banker, and which requires a different quality of engagement. You find this kind of conversation the most interesting work you do, more interesting in some ways than the transaction work itself, because it is the place where the analytical and the relational are most fully integrated, where what you know about markets and what you know about Thomas and what you know about the intersection of those two things produces something that neither of you would have arrived at alone. You will think about these conversations later when they have stopped. You will think about what it meant to have had them and then not to have them, and you will understand, with the specificity that only a real loss permits, what the reassignment of the Carlyle relationship actually took from you. Not just the revenue, the work, the specific quality of thinking that happens in the space of a trusted professional relationship, a space that takes years to create, and that is created through consistent reliability and honest analysis, and the accumulated evidence of someone showing up in the way they said they would show up. The client relationship you build with Thomas Holloway in your second and third years is the kind of relationship that the firm's literature talks about when it describes what its people do, the relationship that is supposed to be the product of the work, the network of trust and mutual understanding that transforms a transaction into a partnership. Thomas is the CFO of a manufacturing company with annual revenues that put him in the upper tier of clients for your group, and he is thoughtful about his work in the way that makes working with him feel like a collaboration rather than a service transaction. He asks good questions, he listens to the answers, he makes decisions with a deliberateness that you respect, even when the decisions he makes are not the ones you would have recommended. Thomas introduces you to Robert Kane, who runs the parent company's investment committee, at a dinner in the autumn of your third year. Robert is the kind of person who tests people in social situations in ways that are designed to look like conversation. He asks you about the Federal Reserve's interest rate policy in a way that is clearly a test of whether you have a substantive view, and you give him a substantive view, and the substantive view leads to a 20-minute conversation about monetary policy and its effects on the manufacturing sector that has the quality of a good seminar, the quality of two people who both know the material and are interested in finding the edges of their agreement and disagreement. Robert concludes the dinner by telling Thomas, in your presence but addressing Thomas as though you were not present, that you were sharp. Thomas says he knows. You note the grammar of this exchange. The grammar is, you're being discussed in the third person in your own presence. You're the subject of the sentence rather than a participant in the conversation. The grammar is not hostile. Robert's assessment is positive, and his manner is not dismissive, but the grammar locates you in a particular position in the social architecture of this dinner, a position adjacent to the conversation about you rather than inside it. You have seen this grammar before. You will see it again. You file it in the place where you file observations about how things actually work. What you also file is Thomas's response afterward, in the car on the way to his hotel, when he says directly to you that Robert was impressed, and that the relationship with Robert's committee is one that the firm has been trying to build for 2 years, and that you just accelerated it considerably. Thomas says this looking at you, addressing you as the participant you are, and the contrast with the dinner grammar is something he seems aware of, because there is a quality to his directness that feels like a correction of something. You appreciate the correction. You also note that it was necessary. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. You tell your husband first, on a Tuesday night in October, in the kitchen of your apartment in the East 70s. The city is outside the window doing what it always does, moving and lit and fundamentally indifferent to the specific gravity of any particular evening in any particular kitchen, and you're inside the city with this new fact, which changes the texture of everything without changing anything visible yet. He puts down the glass he's holding. He looks at you with an expression that contains several things simultaneously, which is an expression you have come to associate with him specifically, with the particular quality of his attention. He is a lawyer on Park Avenue, and he works long hours too, and you have been building a life together for 3 years, building it with the same deliberate care that you bring to your financial models, attending to the assumptions on which it rests. The new fact rearranges those assumptions. Not catastrophically. You have savings. You have thought about this as you think about everything, in advance and with a plan. But the plan was always abstract before, a plan for a future that was future. Now it is a plan for a thing that is happening, and the gap between those two categories, between planning for a future event and navigating a present one, is larger than any amount of prior planning can fully close. You tell your mother the following weekend on the phone. She cries, which you expected. She asks immediately about work, which you also expected, because your mother is a woman who spent 25 years in an institution that required her to manage the same calculation you are now beginning to calculate, and she knows from lived experience that the intersection of career and pregnancy is a place where things can go wrong in ways that are difficult to see coming and difficult to address once they arrive. Your mother did not have the career you have. She worked in administration at a hospital for 20 years and was passed over for supervisory positions she was qualified for, and eventually retired with a pension that was smaller than it should have been, and a carefully maintained silence about why. She never spoke to you about this silence while you were growing up. She spoke about it once, briefly, when you told her you were going to Wharton, and what she said was simply, "I hope it's different for you," with a tone of voice that contained both hope and doubt in approximately equal measure. You do not tell anyone at work for 11 weeks. This is the calculation everyone makes. 11 weeks takes you past the highest risk period. It gives you time to think through the conversation you will need to have with Martin, to plan its structure and its framing and its emphasis, to approach it the way you would approach any important professional communication. It gives you time to observe the landscape before you become visible in it. What you observe in those 11 weeks is not encouraging. Beverly in the equity research group is 7 months pregnant and visibly sidelined, not dramatically, not in any way that you could name in a meeting and have the naming be unambiguous. Her research coverage has narrowed. She appears in fewer client meetings. When she is in client meetings, she is introduced consistently as supporting the team, a description that understates her actual contribution in a way that is real but that each individual instance of can be explained by something other than her pregnancy. The pattern is the thing, not any individual data point, and patterns are designed to be deniable at the level of the individual data point. Beverly herself does not discuss this. You try to approach the subject with her once, obliquely, carefully, the way you approach anything that is sensitive and important and potentially destabilizing. She deflects with a warmth and a firmness that tells you she has made a decision about how she's going to manage this period, a decision that involves maintaining a composure about things she cannot change and focusing her energy on the things she can. You respect this. It is a sensible decision. It also means you cannot learn from her what she's experiencing, because the experience is being managed in a way that makes it unavailable to you. You tell Martin on a Wednesday morning in your 3rd year. You have prepared for this conversation with the thoroughness you bring to deal preparation. You have a plan for the next 8 months. You have a proposed schedule for your maternity leave, which will be unpaid, because the firm offers 6 weeks unpaid at your level and nothing guaranteed beyond that, and because it will be 1993 before the Family and Medical Leave Act creates a federal right to leave, and you are in 1987, and the law has not caught up to your situation yet. You have thought about how to frame the conversation so that it centers on continuity and planning and the absence of disruption to the deals you are working on. You go into his office with your plan and your composed face and your navy suit, and you tell him. Martin listens to everything you say. He is a tall man with a good poker face, and he listens carefully and he says the right things. He says congratulations. He says the firm supports its people through life events. He says you have been an outstanding analyst, and the firm looks forward to the next chapter of your career here. He says all of this, and it sounds like the right things, and it is the right things, in the sense that he means them when he says them, and they are also conditional in the sense that none of them describe what will actually happen. There is a gap between what Martin says in this meeting and what the institution will do, and the gap is the thing you cannot see clearly yet, that you are only beginning to see the edges of. What actually happens begins quietly, with the Anderson deal. The Anderson deal is significant, the kind of transaction that, assigned to an analyst at your level, would represent real advancement. 3 weeks after you tell Martin about your pregnancy, the Anderson deal goes to a male colleague named Stephen. Not to you, not even to you in a supporting role, simply to someone else. When you ask Robert about it, quietly, the way you ask about anything sensitive, he says the timing didn't quite work out, which is not an explanation but a way of indicating that the conversation about this particular thing is over. The second thing is the Carlyle client. Thomas, who has been calling you directly for 8 months, begins calling less. Then the calls start going to David, a colleague who has had no previous relationship with Carlyle. This happens gradually, the way water finds around an obstacle, and when you try to trace exactly when it started, you cannot find a single moment, only the slow accumulation of evidence that the relationship has been rerouted. You buy a notebook, a plain one, navy blue. You write the date on the first page, you write down the Anderson deal and when you heard about it and what you were told. You write down the last time Thomas called you directly and the first time you noticed a Carlyle email going to David instead. You write these things down at home, at the desk in the corner of your bedroom, at night, in the careful handwriting of someone who understands that she is documenting something and who wants the documentation to be legible and specific and permanent. The notebook is just a notebook. What it contains is a record of a pattern. You do not know yet what you will do with the record. You know that the alternative to keeping it is to let the pattern dissolve into the atmosphere of the institution, where it will be absorbed and neutralized and, if ever raised, denied. Diane calls on a Thursday evening in February. Her voice has a quality you have not heard in it before. She says she has something to tell you. She pauses. She says she is pregnant. There is a silence on the phone, the silence of two people who have the same information and are both processing what it means to have it. Then Diane says, "I'm scared." And you say, "I know," and you do. You know exactly what she means and why she means it, and neither of you has to say anything else for that to be true. The afternoon you tell Martin, you walk back to your desk through the corridor that connects his office to the trading floor, and you feel the particular quality of having released information that cannot be unreleased. The information is out in the world now. Martin has it. It will move from Martin in the ways that information moves in institutions, through the formal channels and the informal ones, and by the end of the week, the people who need to know will know, and the people who don't need to know but will find out, and the adjustment of the system to this new fact will begin. You sit at your desk. The Quatron glows, the phones ring. Catherine is 2 desks down, doing whatever Catherine is doing, which is always visibly working. The floor sounds the way it always sounds. Nothing has changed. Everything has changed. The new fact is in the room now, distributed into the air of the institution, and what the institution will do with it is something you're about to find out. The notebook. You buy it on the way home that evening at a stationery store near your apartment. A plain notebook, navy blue, which is not a choice you made consciously, but which you notice afterward with a kind of rueful amusement. You take it home, and you write the date on the first page and you describe the conversation with Martin, noting specifically what was said and what was not said, and the expressions that were and were not used, and the things that the conversation left open. You describe the feeling in the room, which is a different category of data from the words that were spoken, but which is also data. You describe the way Martin said congratulations, with the particular cadence of someone who is saying a word they mean while also beginning to manage a situation. The meeting with Martin happens on a Tuesday morning in November, 3 weeks after your announcement. You have prepared for the meeting in the way that you prepare for everything consequential, with documentation, with a clear sense of what you want to convey and what you want to learn, and with the specific kind of composure that you have developed over 4 years on this floor, the composure that is not the absence of feeling, but the management of its expression. Martin is the senior vice president who runs your group, and who has been, until now, consistently positive in his assessments of your work. The quality of his positivity has a different texture than it did before you walked into his office that morning. Martin's response to your announcement is correct. The word you keep returning to is correct. He says the right things. He expresses congratulations. He uses the word support. He mentions the firm's policies regarding maternity leave and says that you should coordinate with HR about the specifics. He does not say anything that is wrong or that could be cited later as evidence of anything. He is a careful person, and the meeting is managed with care, and the management of it is itself a piece of information about what is happening and why. You walk out of Martin's office and you walk to your desk and you sit down and you look at the Quatron terminal and the amber light and the number on the screen that represents the current state of the market, which does not know or care about the conversation you just had. You have 5 active deal relationships. The Anderson transaction is the largest. The Anderson CFO, a man named David Holloway, who has been your primary contact on the deal and who you have spent 8 months building a relationship with, will receive a call in the following week from someone in your group. The call will be framed as a check-in, as proactive communication during your upcoming leave. David will understand it as a transition. The navy blue notebook begins the week after the meeting with Martin, not because any single thing that happened in the meeting or in the week following it is a legal violation in a provable sense, but because you have been trained to document things that matter, and this matters, and the pattern you are beginning to see has a shape that you want to have a record of. The notebook is small, fits in your briefcase, and has a quality of purposefulness that the situation requires. You write in it in the evenings after you get home, when the day is complete enough to assess. You write facts, dates, specific conversations, who was present, what was said, what was not said. You do not write interpretations in the notebook. Interpretations can be revised. Facts are harder to revise. Diane's call comes on a Saturday, 3 weeks after your announcement. She does not begin with pleasantries in the way that she sometimes does. She begins by asking whether you have time to talk, which means that what she has to say will take more than a few minutes, and by the time she's asked you already know, from the quality of the question, that what she has is information rather than support in the abstract sense. She tells you what she's observed in the deal assignment patterns over the past 3 weeks, who has been in what rooms and which client relationships appear to be shifting. She tells you this not because she is certain of what it means, but because she thought you should have the information. She says she hopes she is wrong. She does not sound like she thinks she is wrong. In January of 1989, a woman named Felice Schwartz published an article in the Harvard Business Review. The article was titled Management Women and the New Facts of Life, and its central argument was that corporations needed to recognize a distinction between 2 kinds of women: those who prioritize career above all else and were willing to sacrifice family to do so, and those who wanted to combine career and family and needed different structures to manage the combination. Schwartz proposed that corporations develop differentiated tracks for these 2 groups, offering women who wanted both career and family more flexibility in exchange for accepting a slower trajectory toward the top. Felice Schwartz did not use the phrase mommy track. That phrase was coined by journalists, specifically by Felice Schwartz's critics in the popular press, who read the article and gave it a name that was both more memorable and more brutal than anything Schwartz had written. The phrase spread quickly because it named something that was already real, something that had been operating in American corporations for years without a name, something that many women recognized immediately as a description of their own experience without needing any further explanation. What the mommy track actually was, in practice, in the investment banks and law firms and consulting companies of the 1980s, was not a formal policy. No company had a written document establishing 2 tiers of women's careers based on their reproductive choices. No HR department had a policy that said, "This woman has announced a pregnancy and will therefore be placed on a different trajectory." What existed instead was a pattern of decisions, individually justifiable, collectively systematic, that produced an outcome that looked like a policy without ever being named as one. The pattern worked like this. A woman announced a pregnancy. Her manager, almost always a man, processed this information through a framework he had absorbed from the institution and from the broader culture, a framework that said, not necessarily consciously or maliciously, that a woman with a child would be less available, less committed, more likely to leave, more likely to need accommodations that made her a less reliable resource for the high-demand situations that defined advancement at this level. The manager made adjustments based on this framework. Not dramatic adjustments, small ones. The deal that went to someone else, the client that was quietly handed off, the committee that she was not put forward for, the assignment that would have made her visible at the next level that was offered to someone else. Each of these small adjustments was deniable. Each one had a plausible explanation that had nothing to do with pregnancy. The timing didn't work out. The client had an existing relationship. The committee needed someone more senior. The deniability was not incidental to the system. It was one of the system's functional features. A system that discriminated in ways that could be named and proved would be vulnerable to legal challenge. A system that discriminated through a pattern of small deniable adjustments was much harder to address, because the individual adjustments were defensible even when the pattern they formed was not. Pregnancy discrimination on the basis of pregnancy itself had been illegal since 1978, when the Pregnancy Discrimination Act amended Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. The PDA said clearly that an employer could not fire a woman for being pregnant, could not refuse to hire her for being pregnant, could not force her to take leave before medical necessity required it, could not treat her pregnancy differently than it would treat any other temporary medical condition affecting an employee's availability. The law was clear. The enforcement was less clear, because enforcement required proving motivation, and proving motivation in a system that operated through small deniable adjustments was the specific kind of difficulty that the system was designed to produce. You know the PDA. You read it in your first year as part of your general effort to understand the legal landscape around your employment. You know that what is happening to you, in the aggregate, in the pattern of the Anderson deal and the Carlyle client and the small adjustments that have been accumulating in your notebook since October, might constitute a violation of it. You also know that proving a pattern of small deniable decisions requires establishing that the pattern exists, which requires documentation, and that the documentation exists in your notebook and is good, and that taking it further requires decisions about what you are willing to do and what the doing of it would cost. You talk to a lawyer. Not a lawyer anyone in your industry would recognize, but an employment lawyer recommended by a law school friend, a woman who practices employment law and who knows the landscape of cases like yours from the inside. The lawyer listens to everything you tell her. She asks specific questions. She reviews your notebook, reading it slowly and without comment. At the end of 2 hours, she tells you that you have a pattern consistent with pregnancy discrimination, that the documentation is careful, that a case is possible. She also tells you what a case would cost, in money and in time and in professional reputation, in an industry where reputation is the primary currency, and the industry is small enough that everyone knows everyone. She asks what outcome you are looking for. You sit with this question for a long time. What outcome are you looking for? You're 7 months pregnant and you are managing your workload while the workload itself is being quietly restructured around you, and you are maintaining the composure that the environment requires, while also carrying a notebook of evidence and having conversations with employment lawyers in offices far enough from your firm that no one will see you there. What outcome? You think about Beverly, who left after her maternity leave and did not return to finance. You think about Catherine, 2 desks down, who has stayed and who has arranged her life with the precision of someone who has decided that the arrangement is worth the cost. You think about the Anderson deal, which has already closed, in which you had no part. You think about Thomas at Carlyle, who has not called you in 3 months and who now calls David. You think about what the pattern in the notebook adds up to, what it will add up to in 5 years if nothing changes, what your career will look like from the outside and from the inside if the trajectory that was bent at the moment of your announcement is never unbent. You think about your son, who is not yet born and who will be born in March and who exists right now as a fact about the future that is also a fact about the present. What outcome are you looking for? The question is genuine and the answer is complicated, and you are going to be sitting with it for a long time, through the remaining weeks of your pregnancy, and through the maternity leave, and through the return to the office and beyond. The notebook is at home on the desk in the corner of your bedroom. The pattern is in it, documented and dated and specific. The outcome is still unknown. The city is outside. The day is ending. You go home on the subway, which is always where you think most clearly, in the motion and the sound, below the city and everything the city contains. The lawyer's office is on the west side in the 40s, nowhere near the financial district. You chose her specifically because she practices entirely on the other side of the city from your office, and because her specialty is employment law, rather than the securities work that would make her visible in your professional network. You told no one you were going. You took a cab rather than the subway, an expense that felt justified by the privacy it provided. You sat in her waiting room for 15 minutes before your appointment, and you read a magazine without reading it, and you thought about the 43 deals you had worked on, and the performance reviews in your file, and the notebook at home, and the gap between what should have happened and what had. And by the time she called your name, you knew what you needed to tell her. The conversation with the lawyer produces something unexpected, which is a quality of being seen clearly by someone who has the professional vocabulary to name what they are seeing. The lawyer has represented women in similar situations before. Not your exact situation, no two are exactly alike, but similar enough that she has a framework for the pattern you are describing, a language for it that is precise rather than impressionistic. Hearing the pattern described in this language, in the language of employment law and evidentiary standards and the specific legal theory under which a case would be brought, produces a kind of clarification that is simultaneously useful and disturbing. Useful because clarity is useful. Disturbing because the thing being clarified is the fact that what has been happening to you is real and describable in the formal language of a legal wrong. You go home from the lawyer's office on the subway, the same subway you take every other evening, the same car, the same sequence of stops. The city outside the window is the city that it always is. But the ride home has a different quality because you are carrying new information about your own situation that is both less and more than you needed. Less because it confirms a pattern without providing a clear path forward. More because the confirmation itself is a form of knowledge. And knowledge, even when it is difficult, is preferable to the alternative. The Pregnancy Discrimination Act was passed in 1978, 6 years before you arrive on the 43rd floor, and its passage was itself a correction of a specific legal problem. In 1976, the Supreme Court had ruled in General Electric v. Gilbert that pregnancy discrimination was not sex discrimination under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, a ruling that was widely criticised by women's advocates as inconsistent with the plain meaning of the statute and with the reality of how pregnancy discrimination operated in the workplace. Congress responded by passing the PDA, which amended Title VII to specify that discrimination on the basis of pregnancy, childbirth, or related conditions constitutes sex discrimination and is therefore prohibited. The law is real. The law is specific. The law has teeth in the sense that it creates causes of action and provides remedies. What the law does not do, and what no law of this kind can do directly, is change the informal systems through which discrimination actually operates in environments like the one you're in. The formal systems, the official policies, the stated hiring criteria, the documented performance reviews, are where the law operates. The informal systems are where careers actually happen. The informal systems are where deals get allocated, and where clients get introduced, and where the quiet decisions about who is being groomed for what get made in conversations that do not have a subject line. The employment lawyer you meet with in the autumn after your announcement is a woman named Barbara Weinstein, who practices employment law from an office in Midtown that has the specific character of offices that are serious rather than impressive. She is thorough, and she is honest, and she gives you the information you need to understand what the law can and cannot do for someone in your situation. The law can address adverse employment actions, demotions, terminations, explicit exclusions from opportunities. The law has a harder time with the pattern you are describing, which is a series of individually deniable adjustments that add up, in aggregate, to a significant change in your trajectory. The pattern is real. The pattern would be difficult to litigate. These two things can both be true. Barbara asks you what outcome you're looking for. This is the right question, and you are not yet ready to answer it. You're not ready to answer it because the outcome you want, to simply be treated the way you were treated before your pregnancy, to have the trajectory you were on remain the trajectory you are on, is not a legal outcome in the sense of something a court can order. Courts can order specific remedies for specific violations. They cannot order the restoration of a climate, the reversal of a cultural adjustment, the reinstatement of a quality of perception. You are in a situation that the law can partially address and cannot fully address, and understanding the partial nature of the legal remedy does not tell you what to do with the part the law cannot reach. What the law does give you, Barbara explains, is standing and options. You have standing if an adverse employment action occurs that meets the evidentiary threshold. You have the option of filing a complaint with the EEOC, which initiates a process with specific timelines and requirements. You have the option of documentation, which Barbara recommends regardless of any other decision you make, because documentation is the foundation of any legal action and is also useful in situations where a legal action is not pursued, for reasons that she does not specify but that you understand. Documentation creates a record. A record creates accountability, even when the accountability never reaches a courtroom. The notebook that you have already started keeping is, she says, exactly the right instinct. The baby's born on a Thursday morning in March. He is 7 pounds 4 ounces and he arrives in the way that babies arrive in hospitals in 1988, with the particular controlled chaos of a Lenox Hill morning, and nurses and a doctor who calls you by your first name and the sound of machines that you do not want to know the function of, and then, at the end of all of it, a person. A specific, actual person, smaller than you anticipated and more complete than anything that small has any right to be, who is placed in your arms in a room that has been transformed, by his presence in it, into something different than it was 3 minutes ago. You are lying in a hospital bed and outside the window is a March morning, cold and grey with a particular kind of light that comes through clouds without being filtered by them, a diffuse and even light that makes everything look very clear. You're holding your son, and you're tired in a way that has no analogy in your previous experience of tired. Not the tired of the deal push, not the tired of the training program. This tired goes all the way down to a level that you did not know existed before, a level below the level where the mind operates normally. Your maternity leave is 6 weeks unpaid. This is what the firm offers at your level. You have done the financial planning and the math works, which you know is not a universal situation. You have talked to women in the training programs at other firms who went back at 4 weeks or 3 weeks because the math did not work any other way, because the salary was gone and the savings were insufficient, and the calculation admitted no other answer. 6 weeks is both a long time and a very short time for what you're actually doing, which is existing in a different category of life than the one you've been in for 28 years. The first 2 weeks you do not think about the office at all. This surprises you considerably. You expected the professional anxiety to follow you the way it follows you everywhere, to be present in the background of the maternity leave the way it is present in the background of everything. Instead, the first 2 weeks exist in a kind of suspended time, outside the normal measurement of time, in which the only interval that matters is the 3-hour cycle between feedings, and the only problem to solve is the next immediate one. You are very tired and very alert in a way that seems contradictory but is not, in which the alertness is not the alertness of analytical thinking, but something more basic, something that operates closer to the level of instinct than anything you have experienced in your professional life. By the 3rd week you begin to think about the office again, not with anxiety but with the particular quality of clarity that comes from temporary distance. You begin to see things that you were too close to see when you were inside them. You see the shape of the last 3 years from a perspective that proximity had prevented. You see the pattern in your notebook from the outside rather than from the middle of it, and from the outside the pattern is even more visible than it was when you were documenting individual entries. It has a shape. The shape has a direction. You call Diane. Diane had her baby 2 weeks after you. She sounds like someone who has also discovered the category of tired that exists below the category she was previously familiar with. But when you start talking about work, her voice changes in the same way yours does, gains the same slight quality of sharpened attention that comes from seeing something clearly for the first time. Diane has also lost a deal assignment. Her deal was different from yours, smaller, but the pattern is the same. The announcement followed by the quiet reassignment, the client relationship that began rooting elsewhere. the cumulative effect of small adjustments. This is the conversation that the maternity leave makes possible, the conversation that the office made difficult because the office requires a certain composure about things that are happening, a composure that has survival value in the environment, and that also makes certain truths harder to see clearly. At home, in the particular quietness of a maternity leave, the composure is not required, and the clarity comes. Diane says she is not sure she wants to go back. She says it not as a complaint or a defeat, but as a genuine statement of uncertainty, the kind of uncertainty that follows from having run a calculation and found that the terms of the deal have changed. You understand what she means. You're running the same calculation. If the pattern in your notebook continues after your return, the trajectory that felt so clear 3 years ago will have been permanently altered. Not ended. Altered. You will still have a career. You will still have a salary. You will just never move up in the way that your performance would otherwise warrant. This is the specific mechanism of the mommy track, not the firing of women, not the dramatic demotion, the quiet, sustainable, legally defensible practice of leaving women exactly where they are while the institution moves around them. Your title stays the same, your salary stays the same. Nobody does anything that could be pointed to in a meeting or reported to HR, or described to a lawyer with the same clarity as a firing. The discrimination is in what does not happen. It is in the absence of things. It is in the not promoted, the not assigned, the not introduced, the not included, in the conversation at the bar with the backroom. The 6th week of your leave comes. Your son can hold his head up for a few seconds at a time. He has learned to recognize your face. When you lean over him, he produces an expression that is almost certainly not a smile yet, but that you call a smile anyway because the developmental timeline can wait and the expression is what it is. You are supposed to go back to the office on Monday. You call Martin on Thursday. You tell him you would like to come back, but you would like to discuss your responsibilities first. There is a pause on the phone. Martin says, Of course. Let's set up a meeting." His voice has the smooth, professional warmth of someone who is very good at managing situations, and this is, you understand, a situation that requires managing. The meeting is on Friday morning. You take the subway downtown in a suit that fits differently than it did 7 months ago, a fact that you have addressed with 2 new blouses and a determination that the suits themselves will fit again within a month, a determination that is partly vanity and partly the awareness that the uniform still matters and cannot be conceded. You sit across the desk from Martin and you listen to what he says, and you ask the specific questions about the specific deals and the specific clients, and the answers have the same vagueness as the explanations that preceded them. Vagueness that is not quite lying, but that is also not quite the full truth. You go back on Monday. You're wearing the navy suit. You're carrying the briefcase. The elevator opens on the 43rd floor and the air hits you first. The recycled chill and the cigarette smoke and the smell of 1,000 people in a building that was built before anyone thought much about the air inside it. The carpet is still burgundy. The walnut paneling is on the walls. Your desk is clear, and your quattron is glowing amber, and the phones are already ringing, and everything is exactly as it was before you left. But you are not the same. Something has happened in those 6 weeks that has nothing to do with the baby, or not only to do with the baby, that is about the particular clarity of distance, and about what you saw when you had it. You are back. The question is what being back will mean, and whether the terms of back are the terms you agreed to when you first stepped out of the elevator in your navy suit 3 years ago, and whether those terms have changed in ways that were not disclosed and cannot be disputed. The maternity leave produces an education that the office would not have produced. This is not what you expected. You expected the leave to be a period of professional suspension, a gap in the professional narrative that would need to be managed on return. Instead, it is a period of involuntary perspective, the way that any removal from a situation provides a perspective on the situation that proximity prevents. You see the shape of the last 3 years differently from outside it than you did from inside it, and the shape you see from outside is both more clearly defined and more troubling than the shape you were seeing from inside. The people who talk about maternity leave as a professional setback are not wrong exactly. There is a sense in which 6 weeks outside the flow of deal activity, outside the informal conversations and the visible commitments and the daily accumulation of relationship equity, is a gap that needs to be closed. But the conversation about maternity leave as setback tends to focus on what was missed during the leave rather than on what was revealed by it. The perspective the leave provides is real, and it is information. What you do with the information is the question. Your husband handles more of the domestic logistics in the 6 weeks of the leave than he has in the 3 years of your marriage. Not all of it, because you are home and you are not incapacitated, but more, and the experience of more gives both of you information about the default distribution of domestic labour that has been operating in your marriage, the default that exists below the level of conscious choice, and that the maternity leave makes briefly visible. You talk about this carefully because the conversation has the potential to be difficult, and you are both tired, and the conversation produces some adjustments that will not all persist, but some of which will, and the ones that persist matter. You check out of the hospital on a Wednesday. Your son is 6 days old and he weighs 7 pounds 4 ounces, and he has a quality of complete self-containedness that seems, to you, remarkable in something so recently arrived in the world. He does not know what year it is. He does not know that he was born 6 blocks from the hospital, where you were told by a colleague covering for another colleague that the Anderson deal had been rerouted. He does not know any of the things that you know. He knows warmth and hunger and the particular frequency of your voice, which he has heard from inside for months, and which makes him stop moving when he hears it, which seems to you like information about what matters. The 6 weeks of leave stretch in a way that time has not stretched since childhood. The days are long in the sense of being full. There is no time that is not occupied by something the baby requires, and simultaneously strange in the sense that the occupation is of a completely different kind than the occupation you are used to. You are not processing information in the way the office requires. You are not making decisions in the compressed and consequential way that deals require. You're doing something that is in some ways more demanding and in some ways more elemental, something that your body knows how to do in ways that your analytical mind cannot fully account for, and the quality of presence required is different from any professional presence you have developed. Diane calls in the 4th week. She has had her own conversations with Martin in the month since your announcement, and the conversations have the same quality of yours, productive on the surface, informative below the surface, unreassuring in their implications. She's not pregnant. She does not plan to be pregnant for at least another 2 years. But she is watching what is happening to you, and she is updating her own calculations, which is what a thoughtful person does when the evidence arrives. She asks you how you are. You tell her honestly. She tells you that she has been watching the deal assignments on your group's floor, and that the pattern you described is continuing, and that she wanted you to know, because she thought you should have the information even though you cannot use it yet. The clarity that the leave gives you is real, and it is something you will try to hold on to when you return. It is not clarity about what to do. It is clarity about what is happening, which is a different and in some ways more useful thing. What is happening is that you work in an institution that was built by and for a particular kind of person, in a particular kind of life, and you are not that kind of person, and you do not have that kind of life, and the institution is responding to the gap between what it expected and what you are in the way that institutions respond, not with malice, exactly, but with the automatic preference of a system for elements that fit its existing structure. The system is not personal, the system does not know your name, but you live in the system personally, and the system's impersonality is not a comfort. You read Felice Schwartz's article in February of 1989. You read it at home, in the evening, after your son is asleep, which is how you read everything that requires actual attention now, in the space between his bedtime and yours that is also the space in which you have been doing the reading for your informal education, in what is happening to you and why, and what other people have said about it, and what the law says and what the law does not say, and what the gap between those two things might mean for your specific situation. The article lands in the professional world like something dropped from a significant height. Not because Schwartz is saying things that no one has observed before, but because she's saying them in the Harvard Business Review, which is not a feminist publication, and which is read by the people who run the institutions being described, which gives the argument a credibility and a visibility in corporate America that it would not have had in a different venue. The response is immediate and deeply divided, which tells you something about how raw the subject is, about how much energy is stored in the question the article is raising. Gloria Steinem coins the phrase mommy track in a New York Times editorial that frames Schwartz's proposal as a capitulation to discrimination rather than a pragmatic response to it. Steinem's argument is that creating a formal, slower track for mothers does not solve the problem of sex discrimination in corporate America. It institutionalizes it. It takes what has been operating as an informal and deniable pattern, the very pattern documented in your notebook, and makes it official policy. The problem, Steinem argues, is not that women with children need a different track. The problem is that the existing track was designed for men with wives at home, and has never been redesigned for anyone else. And the solution to that problem is redesigning the track, not creating a supplementary one. The counter-arguments come from women who read Schwartz's proposal as a realistic description of a real constraint rather than an endorsement of it. Their argument is that the choice between total career commitment and family life is already being forced on women, has been forced on them since women entered these institutions, and that Schwartz is at least proposing that companies acknowledge this openly and create structures around it rather than pretending the choice doesn't exist while enforcing it through the informal pattern that you have been living inside for the past 18 months. You read both sides of this debate with the concentration you give to things that are about your actual life, because the debate is about your actual life. The slow track pattern you are currently experiencing is the thing both sides are describing. The question of what to do about it is the question you are trying to answer, and both sides of the debate are offering an answer that is, when you look at it carefully, incomplete. Steinem is right that formal accommodation of a pattern is different from eliminating the pattern. The counter-arguments are right that the pattern is real and is operating now and needs a response that exists in the present rather than in the future when the pattern has been eliminated. What strikes you most about Schwartz's article, reading it more carefully than the initial response required, is the data about turnover. Schwartz cites research showing that the cost of employing women is higher than the cost of employing men, a claim that generated its own controversy, and that the primary driver of this difference is turnover. Women leave these institutions at higher rates than men, and the primary reason they leave is the failure of the institutions to accommodate the combination of career and family that more women than men are attempting to manage. The cost of losing these women exceeds the cost of the accommodations that might retain them. This is not a moral argument. It is a business argument. It is the kind of argument that should, in theory, be persuasive in an environment where everything is eventually expressed as a number. You have a conversation with Martin about the December promotion cycle, in which 2 male associates with comparable tenure were promoted and you were not. You have prepared for this conversation. You have your documentation, not the notebook, which you do not bring into the office, but your performance record, which is strong and specific examples of your contributions, and the timing, which is consistent with the pattern. Martin listens. He uses the word pipeline. He uses the phrase next cycle. He says the firm has high expectations for your continued contributions. He says things that are true in the sense that they are the right words for this situation, and that do not constitute any commitment that could be held against him later. You walk out of Martin's office and you stand for a moment in the corridor. The floor is doing its usual thing around you, the phones, the amber, the sound of transactions happening in real time. You're thinking about the Schwartz article and the debate it generated and the specific question that the debate does not answer, which is what an individual woman in an individual institution is supposed to do with the information that the system she is in has a structural problem. The debate is about policy. You are in a situation. Situations require responses that are different from the responses appropriate to policy debates. By the time of the Schwartz article, you have been back at the firm for 8 months. In those 8 months, the pattern has continued, more quietly than in the months immediately following your announcement, as though the initial adjustments have settled into a new steady state, and the adjustments themselves are no longer active but the effects of them persist. Your deal flow is smaller than it was before your pregnancy. Your client relationships have changed in ways that are real, but that would be difficult to characterize in any single conversation as evidence of anything. The notebook has new entries. The question the article debate does not answer is the question you have been sitting with since February of the year before, the question the employment lawyer asked you that you have not yet answered to your own satisfaction. What outcome are you looking for? The debate offers 2 answers. One says the system should be changed. The other says the system should accommodate you differently within its current structure. Neither of these is an answer you can implement unilaterally from your position on the 43rd floor. What you can implement unilaterally is the decision about whether to stay, and on what terms and what you are willing to do, from within your current situation, to move your own trajectory in the direction it should be moving. The article is on your desk at home, your son is asleep. The city is outside doing its late-night thing, you go back to reading, you're not done figuring this out, but you are closer than you were. The clarity that the maternity leave gave you has not gone away. It has settled into a kind of calm certainty about what is happening, which is different from knowing what to do about it, but which is its own form of progress. The debate that Schwartz's article generates has a quality that you recognize from the deal negotiations you have been inside. The quality of a conversation in which the surface argument is about one thing and the underlying argument is about something else. The surface argument is about whether formal accommodation of mothers' different trajectories is good policy. The underlying argument is about whether women's reproductive choices should have professional consequences and whether those consequences are the woman's responsibility to manage or the institution's responsibility to prevent, and this underlying argument is one about power and about who bears the cost of the arrangements that a society makes. The people who are most critical of Schwartz's proposal are largely arguing that the proposal accepts a cost assignment that should be challenged. The cost of combining career and family should not be borne primarily by women. The institution should redesign itself to distribute the cost more equitably, across both parents and across the organization rather than onto the individual woman at the point of her most visible vulnerability. This argument is correct in the sense that it describes accurately who should bear the cost, and incorrect in the sense that it is not a description of what will actually happen in the next 5 years in any specific institution where any specific woman is trying to advance her career. This is the gap that you live in, the gap between the argument about who should bear the cost and the current reality about who does bear it. You are in the gap. The gap is where your career is happening. The argument about where the cost should go is an argument about the future, and the future is real and worth arguing about, and it is also not the present, and the present requires a response that the argument alone does not provide. The timing of the Schwartz article, February 1989, places it at a specific moment in the history of women in corporate America, late enough that there is a generation of women who have been inside these institutions for a decade and who have accumulated experience of the patterns Schwartz is describing, and early enough that the data is still contested and the institutions have not been required by pressure or law to address it in any systematic way. The article is a kind of mirror held up to an experience that many women had been living individually and largely without external confirmation. The controversy the article generates is evidence of how much energy was stored in the question. You follow the debate in the newspapers and in the professional publications with the attention you give to things that are directly about your situation. The responses divide roughly along lines you could have predicted. Women who have chosen not to have children, or who have not yet confronted the question, tend to be more sympathetic to Schwartz's pragmatism. Women who have already experienced what Schwartz is describing tend toward Gloria Steinem's response, the argument that accommodation of a pattern is not the same as eliminating the pattern. Men in positions of institutional authority tend to cite the article as evidence that the disparities they have been observed to benefit from are natural outcomes of women's own choices rather than the product of institutional structure. What nobody in the public debate is saying, quite, is what you know from the inside of your specific situation, that the choice Schwartz is describing, between total commitment and the mommy track, is not actually a choice in any meaningful sense when one of the options has been removed without your consent. You did not choose a slower track. The track was adjusted around you while you were on leave through a series of decisions that were each individually defensible and that collectively amount to a rerouting. The language of choice that the debate employs is imprecise in a way that matters, because the imprecision allows the adjustments to be characterized as responses to your choices when they are actually prior to your choices, preceding them, shaping the conditions in which any choice you make will operate. The conversation with Martin in March, after the December promotion cycle has passed without your name on the list, has a quality of careful management on his part that you have become very skilled at reading. He uses words that are complimentary, and words that are forward-looking, and words that are vague in precisely the ways that vagueness is useful when you want to communicate encouragement without making a commitment. Pipeline, next cycle, high regard, continued confidence. The words are real words in the sense that they are being spoken by a person who means something by them, but the meaning they carry is not the meaning of a promise. The meaning they carry is the meaning of an explanation that is designed to satisfy without committing. You leave the conversation and you stand in the corridor and you look at the floor for a moment. The carpet is still burgundy. The Quatron terminals are still amber. The sounds of the floor are the sounds they have always been. You have been here for 5 years. You have closed deals and built relationships and documented your performance and learned the grammar of this environment in ways that took years to learn and that are genuinely valuable and that exist inside you as a competence that belongs to you regardless of what happens next. You walk back to your desk. You have work to do. And you are not done figuring out what you are going to do about the thing that the work cannot solve. The notebook by February 1989 has 14 months of entries. The entries are factual and specific, and each one is dated. Reading them in sequence is an exercise in pattern recognition that requires no interpretive leap. The pattern is present in the facts themselves, in the dates and the names and the specific things that changed, and when they changed, and what accompanied the changes. You have shown the notebook to Barbara Weinstein, the employment attorney, and to Diane, and to one of the women from the dinner group who has her own attorney. The consensus is that the notebook is solid documentation, and that the pattern it documents is consistent, and that the question of what to do with it is a question about strategy and risk tolerance, and what outcome you're trying to achieve, not a question about whether the pattern is real. What you have concluded by February 1989, reading the Schwartz article and the responses to it, and sitting with the question that the employment lawyer asked, is that the outcome you want cannot be achieved through litigation alone, even if the litigation was successful, which is not certain. What you want is to finish the trajectory that you were on before your announcement, to make vice president at the time and in the manner that your performance warranted, which is a thing that a court cannot restore to you because the moment for it has passed. What you can pursue is the forward trajectory, the question of what happens next, which is a question that is still open, and that the documentation in the notebook is partly about keeping open by making it harder for the adjustments to continue without a visible record that they are continuing. This is a strategy, not a resignation. You're not accepting the track. You're documenting the track while you figure out the angle from which you can most effectively challenge it, which is a different thing, and it requires patience and a tolerance for ambiguity that the situation does not make easy, but that you are developing because the situation requires it. The patience is not passive. You are working. You are building. You are maintaining the relationships that can be maintained and letting go, with appropriate documentation of the ones that have been taken from you. You're doing all of this in parallel with the actual work of the deals you are on, which continues to be good work, which continues to be documented, which continues to build a record that the forward trajectory depends on. There is a group of women who meet for dinner every 6 weeks. The restaurant is on the Upper East Side, Italian, with tables in the back that are slightly more private than the front, and it is not a place where anyone from your firm is likely to eat, which is a criterion that was established early and that everyone understands without discussing. The group is 7 women, all working in finance or in adjacent industries, all at roughly comparable levels in their institutions, all navigating roughly comparable landscapes. The group assembled itself the way these groups assemble, through the network of women who find each other in close-knit professional worlds when the shared difficulty of their situation becomes something that requires shared acknowledgement to remain bearable. The dinners run long. The restaurant has learned to not bring the check until someone asks for it. The conversation begins with professional updates, who is working on what, which firms are doing interesting things, which deals are coming, the regular currency of professional life among people who work in the same industry. And then, by the second bottle of wine, it moves to the other subject, the one that exists underneath the professional updates, the one that the professional updates are partly a way of not talking about, and partly a way of approaching obliquely before you can talk about it directly. Ellen is a corporate lawyer at a firm on Park Avenue. She announced her pregnancy 8 months ago, and within 3 weeks her primary client relationship, a pharmaceutical company she had cultivated for 4 years, was transferred to a male partner. The transfer was framed as a client request. Ellen does not believe it was a client request. She has no way to verify this because verifying it would require speaking directly to the client about the reasons for the transfer, which is not a conversation she can initiate without creating problems that would exceed whatever information she might gain from it. Ellen speaks about this without bitterness but with precision, with the same precision she brings to everything. the precision of a lawyer who has learned to describe facts carefully and to distinguish between what she knows and what she infers. She knows the client was transferred. She infers that the pregnancy was the reason. She cannot prove the inference. She is sitting with the gap between those two things. Margaret is a banker at a different firm. She did not announce her pregnancy until her 5th month, when concealment became physically impossible. She wore structured clothing through the first 4 months, dark colours, cuts that did not call attention to the specific changes in her body, and by the time her pregnancy became visible, she was 5 months along, and the concealment strategy had either worked or had not worked, and she would never be able to know which, because the counterfactual cannot be run. The deal she had been promised was given to someone else on the same day as her announcement. Whether disclosing earlier would have changed this, she does not know. She's still running the calculation at 9 months later, still turning over the variables in search of an arrangement that produces a different output. You recognize this particular computation. You have been running versions of it yourself. The characteristic feature of the mommy track, as you and the women at this table have experienced it, is that it operates through a process that cannot be cleanly analysed, because the essential data is unavailable. You cannot know what would have happened if you had not gotten pregnant. You cannot know what would have happened if you had disclosed earlier or later or differently. You cannot run the counterfactual. You can only observe the factual, which is specific and documented, and compare it to what you expected and what the objective record of your performance would predict, and find the gap, and sit with the gap and what it means. Linda has been promoted. Linda is one of the women at the dinner, and she has achieved something real, and the table receives her promotion with genuine warmth, because everyone here is capable of holding multiple things simultaneously, of being glad for Linda while also understanding that Linda's success exists in a specific context. Linda is 41 years old, and she stated clearly at a work function 3 years ago that she does not intend to have children, and she is the second woman to reach managing director in her firm's investment banking division, and she is the person that certain institutional narratives will use as evidence that the problem the other women at this table are describing does not exist in the way they are describing it. Linda herself does not participate in this use of her success. Linda is at the dinner every 6 weeks, and she's clear-eyed about what her path cost and what it required, and about the fact that the path she took is not the only path worth considering. What she achieved is real. The conditions under which she achieved it are also real. Both things can be held simultaneously without diminishing either. The conversation at the dinner moves to legal options, which it always does eventually, as a kind of gravitational centre that the conversation approaches and circles and does not quite reach a conclusion about. All of you have spoken to employment lawyers. All of you have received roughly the same assessment. The cases are possible, the patterns are real, the litigation is expensive and uncertain, and the professional cost in a small industry of being a woman who sued her employer is difficult to estimate but clearly not trivial. None of you have sued. This non-decision sits at the table with you, a choice that was made through the operation of a calculation rather than through any single deliberate act. Patricia has joined the dinner for the first time tonight. She is the woman from your office who figured out the uniform over the course of 6 months, who has been promoted once and is performing well and is not yet pregnant. She listens with the concentrated attention of someone who is filing everything away, which is an attention you recognize because it is your own attention, the attention of someone building a model of a system while they still have the distance to see it clearly. You watch Patricia listening and you think about yourself 5 years ago in the training program, going to the Thursday drinks, filing things away. You think about what you would tell yourself now if you could go back to that elevator lobby with the navy suit and the Wharton degree and the whole future arranged before you. The honest answer is that you are not sure. Knowing what you know now would have changed how you saw certain things. It would not necessarily have changed what you decided. You made the decisions you made with the information you had and the values you had, and the calculation of costs and benefits that those values produced. Another version of you, with the same values and the same information she currently had at 26, might have made the same decisions. The dinner ends past midnight. The restaurant is stacking chairs at a respectful distance. You put on your coats and you say goodbye and you hug Diane, who is going through a specific difficulty right now at her firm, longer than you hug the others, a hug that contains the information without stating it. You walk to the subway together, Diane going uptown, you going downtown, and you stand on the platform for a few minutes talking about nothing important, which is its own kind of important. The train comes, you ride home through the dark, your son is with the babysitter, the notebook is at home on the shelf, the Carlisle client has not called in 4 months, the Anderson deal is long since closed, the floor will be the floor tomorrow morning, but the dinner was real, and the conversation was real, and you are 7 women who have been inside an invisible system, and who can, for the length of a dinner and a platform conversation, and the ride home through the dark, name it to each other as clearly as it can be named. The dinner group has a kind of collective wisdom that none of you would have individually, assembled from the specific knowledge each of you has of her own situation, and the pattern recognition that comes from comparing those situations against each other. You're all in different institutions, you're all experiencing different specific incidents, but the incidents have the same shape, the same logic, the same direction. The shape is recognizable across the different contexts and the different personnel and the different specific deals and clients and conversations. The shape is the pattern. The pattern is what you are there to understand. Ellen has developed a theory about the mechanism by which the pattern operates. She calls it the anticipatory accommodation theory, which is a lawyer's name for something that is also expressible as simple prediction. The institution anticipates, on the basis of prior experience and cultural assumption, that a woman who is pregnant will become less available, less committed, more likely to leave, and then it acts on that anticipation by beginning to distribute her responsibilities before she has demonstrated any of the things it is anticipating. The accommodation precedes the need. The adjustment precedes any actual change in performance or availability. The institution is solving for a future problem that may not materialize and that it is partly creating by solving for it. This theory has explanatory power that you find useful. It explains why the adjustments began 3 weeks after your announcement, before anything about your actual performance had changed, before any actual accommodation of pregnancy had been requested or required. The institution was managing a future that it had decided, on the basis of prior experience and cultural assumption, was going to arrive. It was trying to solve a logistics problem, the problem of how to cover your responsibilities when you were not available, without asking whether and when you would actually not be available. The solving of the problem was also the creation of the problem, which is a recursive structure that makes the pattern particularly difficult to interrupt from inside it. The dinner group is Ellen's idea, or at least Ellen is the one who makes the first phone call in the spring after the Schwartz article, to a group of 7 women she knows from various firms and from business school, and from the informal network of women who have been in these institutions long enough to have developed a sense of who else is navigating the same terrain. The group meets monthly at Ellen's apartment on the Upper East Side, which is large enough for 7 people to sit comfortably, and which has a quality of deliberate warmth that Ellen has created in the way that some people create environments through attention to detail and a genuine interest in making people feel at ease. The dinners are not formal, there is no agenda, there is wine and there is food that Ellen makes herself, which is always better than it needs to be, and there is conversation that begins with the ordinary personal and professional updates, and that shifts, reliably, into the kind of conversation that can only happen in a room where everyone shares enough context that the explanatory work is already done. You do not have to explain, in this room, what it means that the deal was rerouted, or that the promotion cycle passed without your name, or that the client dinner had a grammar that placed you adjacent to the conversation about you rather than inside it. The women in this room know what these things mean. They know because they have their own versions of them. Margaret is at Morgan Stanley, and she had her first child the previous year, and her experience of the months after her return has a structure that is familiar to you in every detail. The reduced deal flow, the client relationships that have quietly been assumed by male colleagues, the performance reviews that have a new quality of faint qualification where they used to be direct, the conversations with her manager that are supportive in their language and unreassuring in their implications. Margaret keeps notes. Several of the women in the room keep notes. You compare systems without comparing specific entries. The comparison itself is information. Linda is at a different firm and she has not had children and does not intend to, and she is watching what is happening to Margaret and to you, and to 2 other women in the room who are parents, and she is updating her own model of the institution she is in, and what it will and will not do for women who make different choices. Linda's presence in the room is important, not despite the fact that she has not experienced the specific pattern being discussed, but because of it. She is experiencing adjacent patterns. the ways in which the assumption that she might someday have children already shapes how she is treated, the ways in which the possibility of pregnancy functions as a kind of shadow over her trajectory even though the pregnancy itself has not occurred. The institution is not responding to a fact, it is responding to a probability, and the probability is enough. The question of legal action comes up in the 4th month of the dinners, and the way it comes up is through Patricia, who's been quietly consulting an employment attorney for several months, and who has the most documented case of anyone in the room. Patricia's attorney has told her what Barbara told you. The law can address adverse employment actions that meet an evidentiary threshold. And the patterns being described are real, but are structured in ways that are designed to be individually deniable. Patricia's attorney has also told her that employment litigation is slow and expensive, and professionally complicated in ways that extend beyond the legal outcome, and that the professional complications are real regardless of how the legal case resolves. The conversation about litigation is careful and honest, and reveals how different each person's calculation is. Ellen is in a situation where her firm has been marginally better, and where she does not want to burn a relationship she's still trying to build. Margaret's documentation is strong, but her financial situation is such that she cannot afford several years of legal uncertainty. Linda is not eligible because the pattern she has experienced is not yet a specific adverse action. You're still building your case and still not sure what outcome you're trying to achieve. 7 women, 7 different calculations. The collective conclusion is not a conclusion but a holding pattern. Document, continue, see what develops, stay in contact. It is not the resolution the situation deserves, it is the response the situation allows. The choices that women made in response to the mommy track in the late 1980s and early 1990s were as varied as the women themselves, and this needs to be said clearly because the telling of this kind of story carries a powerful temptation toward uniformity, toward a narrative in which all the women experienced the same thing and made the same choice and arrived at the same destination. This narrative is emotionally coherent and historically false. The women inside this system were various people with various priorities and various resources and various tolerances for various kinds of difficulty, and their responses reflected that variety. Beverly left. She went back after her maternity leave and lasted 8 months, and then she accepted a position at a management consulting firm that was building its finance practice and needed her specific expertise. She was very good at it. She eventually became a partner and made a significant amount of money and described her work, in the years when you ran into her at industry events, as more interesting than what she'd been doing at the bank. Her departure from the bank was read by the people at the bank who read it, in different ways depending on who was reading. Some of them read it as her inability to sustain the demands of the career. Others read it, more accurately, as her assessment that the deal available to her at the bank was not the deal she had agreed to when she signed her offer letter, and that the consulting firm was offering her a different deal, and that a different deal was worth the transition cost. Catherine stayed. Catherine is still 2 desks down from you, though both of you are more senior now than you were in 1984, and Catherine has a daughter who is in school in Westchester, and who Catherine sees on weekends and some weekday evenings. Catherine made decisions about her life that are different from the decisions you made, decisions that reflect a different weighting of the variables in the calculation that all of you are making. You do not know the full calculation because you are not inside her life. You know the visible outcome of the calculation, which is that Catherine is still on the floor and is still excellent at her work and is still the person, 2 desks down, whose presence you have relied on, in ways you have not always articulated for several years. Sandra made managing director. The announcement came in her 11th year at the firm, and it produced a complicated response in the group of women you know, which is a response you have come to understand as one of the characteristic responses to a certain kind of achievement in a certain kind of system. The pride is real. Sandra achieved something genuinely difficult and genuinely important, and the pride in her achievement is genuine. The complication comes from the accompanying awareness of what her path required, the specific conditions that appear to have been necessary for it to be available to her. Sandra has no children. Sandra has never, in your presence or anyone else's presence as far as you know, brought her personal life to work. Sandra's achievement is real. The cost of it is something only Sandra can fully account for. Diane went back after her maternity leave and lasted a year, and then she and her husband moved to Connecticut and Diane joined a smaller boutique advisory firm. She has described it as imperfect but human, which is a description that you have turned over many times since she said it, imperfect but human. The implication is that the large institutions are something else, something that is more perfect and less human, something that operates according to its own logic, and that accommodates the humans inside it to the extent that they can be made to fit the logic rather than the other way around. Diane sounds different on the phone from Westport than she did in the office or at the dinner. She sounds, you have decided after some thought, rested. You're still in the middle of your decision. This is the honest version of where you are. You have not left. You have not sued. You have not resolved the calculation into a clean answer that can be stated and acted on. You're still at the firm, still doing the work, still maintaining the relationships and the visibility and the composure that the environment requires, still adding entries to the notebook at home, still having the dinner every 6 weeks with the group of women who are the only people with whom you can be fully specific about what is happening. The decision exists in a form that is provisional. You've made the decision to stay, for now subject to revision. You've made the decision to continue building your case through documentation and performance, and the kind of careful internal advocacy that your situation permits, subject to the assessment of whether this strategy is producing results. You have made the decision to stay in conversation with the employment lawyer, subject to the development of circumstances that would change the cost-benefit calculation around litigation. You're managing the decision the way you manage deals, with awareness of where the options are and what they require, and what the conditions for exercising them are. Your son is 2.5 years old. He has opinions about which book to read at bedtime, and a vocabulary that has expanded in the last 6 months from approximately 20 words to what feels like hundreds, the language arriving in him in the particular rush that it arrives in children this age, as though a door has been opened and everything that was waiting behind it is coming through at once. He knows the name of every animal in a picture book, and he can count to 12, and he has a best friend named Marcus who is 6 months older, and who he follows with an expression of uncomplicated devotion that makes you understand certain things about human attachment that you previously understood only theoretically. You pick him up on Wednesdays from the daycare centre in the East 70s, on the days when you have arranged your schedule to leave by 5:30, which is an arrangement that requires advanced coordination, and which is not always possible, but which is possible on Wednesdays. The daycare centre in the late afternoon has a specific quality of light, the afternoon sun falling across the construction paper artwork hung on the walls, the smell of finger paint and juice and small children at the end of the day, their particular weariness, which is a cheerful weariness, the weariness of people who have spent all day being fully alive. On Wednesdays, the transition from the 43rd floor to this room is one of the more dramatic transitions in your week. Both are real, both are yours. The management of the distance between them is its own kind of work. The choice, when you look at it clearly from the outside of it, is not between career and family, because you have both, imperfectly, in the way that everyone who has both things always has them imperfectly. The choice is whether this specific institution, with its specific culture and its specific pattern and its specific trajectory for people like you, is the right institution in which to continue having both. Whether the trajectory can be straightened from where you are, or whether straightening it requires starting over somewhere else. Whether the cost of starting over is lower than the cost of continuing to work around the pattern in your current position. You're going to make a decision. You're making it right now, in real time, in the daily accumulation of information about whether things are changing, and in which direction and at what pace. The subway is where you think about this most clearly. Something about the motion and the sound, and the impossibility of doing anything else while you are in transit, creates the condition for a certain kind of thinking, and every evening on the downtown train you are a little further along in the decision that you will eventually name. The train runs, the city passes, you're not where you were, you're not yet where you're going. The conversation you need to have with yourself about whether to stay is a conversation you have been having for 2 years, and it is complicated by the fact that the answer depends on variables that are themselves moving. The institution is changing, however slowly. The external landscape is changing. Your own situation within the institution is evolving. The calculation at any given moment reflects the state of all these variables at that moment, and the state is not static, and the decision therefore cannot be static either. You're not making a permanent choice, you're making a provisional one, subject to revision as the evidence develops. The things that keep you here are real. The work is real. The relationships you have built are real. The credential that this firm provides, the specific weight of having been a vice president at this specific institution, is real in ways that a credential from a smaller or less prestigious firm is not quite real in the same way. And this difference matters when you think about the next phase of whatever the career will be. You're here for reasons that are still sufficient, if just sufficient, and the sufficiency is itself information about where you are in the calculation. There is also the consideration of what leaving means for the people you are leaving behind. Not a sentimental consideration, but a practical one. If the women at the senior associate level who have the documentation and the performance record leave, the institution's senior associate level becomes more male, and the evidence for the pattern becomes less visible within the institution. The staying of women who are performing well and who are being held back is itself a form of counter-evidence against the institution's capacity to pretend the pattern doesn't exist. You're useful here in ways that are not only about you. Beverly leaves in April. She sends a note to the people she's closest to. You are one of them. And the note is precise and careful and unsentimental, in the way that Beverly has always been in written communication. She's been offered a position at a smaller firm that she will tell you more about when there is more to tell. She says the decision was about what she wanted from the next phase of her professional life, and she says it in a way that is true, and that is also not the whole story. And you understand both of these things simultaneously because you know Beverly, and because you have been in enough of the same conversations to know what the parts of the story are that she is not putting in the note. Beverly's departure is not unusual in the sense that people leave firms. People leave firms for better offers, for new opportunities, for personal reasons, for exhaustion with specific situations. Beverly's departure is one data point in a pattern, and the pattern is that the women who were at the firm when you arrived, the women who were 2 or 3 years ahead of you, are leaving at a rate that is higher than the rate at which their male peers are leaving, and the reasons they give are varied and are each individually true and are also, when you look at the aggregate, telling a consistent story about what these institutions are like to inhabit over time when you are a woman who has tried to have both a career and a life. Catherine stays. Catherine has made a decision that you respect without fully sharing, a decision to work within the system as it is and to find the accommodations that are available and to build what she can build from where she is, which is a legitimate choice, and one that she has thought through carefully, and that reflects her particular situation and her particular assessment of the available options. Catherine has 2 children and a husband who has arranged his work life around their family in a way that gives her more flexibility than you have, and the flexibility matters because it changes the cost structure of staying. You have different constraints, and the constraints produce different calculations. Sandra makes managing director in the fall of that year. Sandra is the woman on the floor who has been most deliberately strategic about her navigation of the institution, most careful about the signals she sends and the relationships she cultivates and the deals she positions herself for. Sandra does not have children. Sandra has said in the dinner group that she does not know whether her choice about children is a genuine preference or a response to her assessment of the institution's constraints, and that she's not sure the two can be fully separated, and that the uncertainty about this is one of the things she finds hardest about her situation. Sandra's managing director promotion is real and deserved, and also, in the context of the dinner group's conversations, a piece of data about which navigations the institution rewards. Diane calls from Connecticut, where she has taken the boutique position, and she is good. She has a quality in her voice that you recognize as relief, not happiness exactly, but the relief of a person who has removed themselves from a situation that was costing something they could not afford to keep paying. The boutique is smaller, and the deals are smaller, and the money is slightly less, and the hours are significantly less, and the culture is different in ways that Diane describes as simply being about whether the institution was built for people who have lives outside it, or whether it was built for people whose lives are the institution. Diane says the boutique was built for people who have lives. She says she's doing good work. She says she is sleeping. On February 5th, 1993, President Clinton signed the Family and Medical Leave Act into law. It was the first bill he signed as president, which was itself a signal, and the signal was received differently by different people, as signals always are. For women in workplaces across the country, the signal was that the federal government had acknowledged, in the specific language of statute, that the combination of career and family was a real thing that real workers managed, and that the management of it required legal protection. For employers, The signal was that a cost they had been avoiding through the absence of legal mandate was now mandatory, which produced a specific kind of institutional response that is familiar to anyone who has watched institutions respond to mandates they did not choose. The FMLA had been passed by Congress twice before this. President George H.W. Bush vetoed it in 1990 and again in 1992. The arguments against it, made consistently and with considerable force, were business arguments primarily about the administrative burden and competitive disadvantage of guaranteeing leave. These arguments were made by lobbying groups representing large employers, and they were made in the language of business efficiency and economic impact, which is the language that has the most credibility in the policy debates about these questions, which are debates in which the costs of the policy are quantifiable and often quantified, and the benefits are diffuse and hard to measure and therefore often not measured. The benefits that were not measured, or not measured well enough to enter the policy debate with the force of the cost arguments, were the benefits that the women in the dinners on the Upper East Side, and the women in Beverly's Equity Research Group, and the women whose notebooks were growing thicker had been experiencing as costs. The cost of leaving. The cost of the talent that walked out the door when the institution failed to accommodate a life that includes children. The cost of the pattern that filtered women out of the pipeline before they could reach the levels where their contributions would compound. These costs existed. They were real. They were not easily expressible as a number in 1990, and policy debates favour numbers. The FMLA, as it passed, guarantees eligible employees up to 12 weeks of unpaid, job-protected leave for certain family and medical reasons, including the birth of a child. Job-protected means that you cannot be fired for taking the leave. It does not mean your client relationships will not be quietly transferred. It does not mean the deal assignments that would have advanced your career will flow to you on the same schedule they would have flowed before your pregnancy. It does not mean the pattern in the notebook stops. What it means is that one specific and extreme form of the retaliation against women who have children is now explicitly illegal, and explicitly illegal is a different category from previously illegal in principle. The employment lawyer called you in the spring of 1993, a few months after the FMLA passed. She wanted to know how things were going. You told her you were still at the firm, still not promoted to VP, the pattern continuing in its quieter post-first-year mode, the notebook still receiving entries. She said the FMLA is not going to change what you're experiencing directly, but it changes the landscape. It signals something about where the culture is going. The conversation is easier to have now than it was 3 years ago. The conversation about pregnancy discrimination in the financial industry was, in fact, easier to have in 1993 than it had been in 1987. Not easy. Easier. The Schwartz article and the debate it generated had put the subject on the record in a way that made it available to be discussed in professional contexts. The FMLA had put it into law in a way that made the discussion of certain specific practices a legal discussion, rather than simply a cultural one. Cases were being brought, some of them settling, some going to trial, collectively establishing a record that was accumulating precedent. The cases that established the clearest precedent were the dramatic cases, the ones where something explicit and documented had occurred, where a supervisor had said something that appeared in a complaint, or where a demotion had been documented in a memo, or where the link between the pregnancy and the adverse action was traceable in the company's own records. These cases were the ones the law could reach most cleanly. The cases that described your experience, the pattern of small deniable adjustments, were harder to reach because the law's mechanisms for reaching them required the plaintiff to construct the pattern from the outside, without access to the internal deliberations that produced it. You have continued adding to your notebook. You have continued maintaining your performance record with the same meticulous care you have always brought to it. You have continued having conversations with Martin that produce the same results, which are vague acknowledgements of your contributions and temporizing about timing and the pipeline. You have continued going to the dinner every 6 weeks, and you have continued being the person who keeps the group's conversation grounded in specifics, rather than allowing it to drift into the diffuse generalities that are easier to express but less useful as a basis for any kind of action. Your son is 3. He turned 3 in March, the same month the FMLA passed, and the coincidence lodged itself in your mind as a kind of marker, a way of remembering when things were. He is in a stage of constant interrogation about the world, asking why with the frequency and sincerity of someone for whom the answer to every why opens a new why, an infinite regress of causation that is both exhausting and wonderful. Why does the sky look like that? Why do the cars stop at that light? Why do you have to go to work? You answer these questions with the care they deserve. You tell him the true things. You tell him that work matters, that the things you do at work are real and important, that the world is full of interesting problems and that the interesting problems are worth working on. You tell him this and you believe it, and it is one of the reasons you have not left, because the work itself is still the extraordinary thing it was when you closed your first deal at 4:47 in the morning on the Uptown Q train. The law is a landscape and you live in the landscape, and the landscape is changing, has been changing since before you arrived on the 43rd floor, is still changing, will continue changing. The change is real and slow and uneven and dependent on the specific individuals who are making the specific decisions in the specific institutions, and whether those individuals have been affected enough by the changing landscape to make different decisions than they would have made before. This is how cultural change actually happens. Not in the signing of a bill, though the signing matters, not in the writing of an article, though the article matters, but in the accumulation of individual decisions in individual situations that slowly, unevenly, over the course of years and decades, shift the aggregate behaviour of institutions. The law signed in February signals a direction. You're watching for the signal to show up in Martin's office, in the review cycle, in the next conversation about the next deal, in the next assessment of who is ready for the next level. The signal travels slowly from the federal government to the practices of a specific division in a specific building on a specific block in Lower Manhattan. You're watching for it to arrive. The FMLA passing in 1993 is a different kind of moment from the Schwartz article in 1989, though both are moments when the subject of women's careers and family life became more publicly discussable. The article opened a debate. The law closed one branch of it, by taking the question of whether job-protected leave should exist and settling it, at least at the federal level, at least for eligible employees. The closing of one question does not open the path forward without complications, because the practice of the law always introduces complications that the text of the law does not anticipate, but the closing is still a closing, still a movement of the cultural position on the subject in a direction that is meaningful. The year 1993 is also the year in which you become finally a VP. The two things are not causally connected. Your promotion was not caused by the FMLA, but they happen in the same year, and the year has a quality of change that is different from the preceding years, a quality of things beginning to shift that is discernible even inside your specific situation, which has been grinding slowly in the direction you want it to go for several years. The shift is not complete. The shift is not irreversible, but it is present, and presence is more than you have been able to say in some of the years that preceded it. What the law changes in your specific situation is the quality of the conversation. You have a conversation with Martin in the spring of 1993, before the November promotion cycle, that is different in character from the conversations you have had before. He uses the word pipeline less. He is more specific about timelines. The specificity may not be enforced, but the specificity is there, and it is new, and something about the changed external environment, the law and the accumulating body of cases and the continuing public conversation about the subject has produced a quality of accountability in the conversation that was not present before. The Family and Medical Leave Act becomes law on February 5, 1993, which is the date that matters, though the date that matters more for understanding what the law represents is the date of the first veto, August 1990, when President Bush signs a veto of a version of the bill that Congress has spent 2 years building. The first veto is followed by a second in 1992, and the pattern of the vetoes is worth understanding, because the pattern is about what the opposition to the law was actually about. The opposition, in its most articulate form, was an economic argument, that requiring employers to provide unpaid leave would impose costs on businesses that were unreasonable and uncompetitive, that the mandate would reduce hiring, particularly of women of childbearing age, because employers would factor in the cost of the leave entitlement when making hiring decisions. This argument was made with the specific confidence of people who believe that the market will price in any intervention and that the pricing will produce outcomes worse than the intervention is intended to address. The argument is not crazy. It is also, as the post-FMLA data will later show, largely wrong about the magnitude of the effects. The argument against the argument was that the absence of a leave entitlement was already producing costs. The cost of losing trained employees, the cost of the health outcomes associated with inadequate recovery time after childbirth, the cost of the economic penalty being borne by individual women and their families rather than distributed across the economy. And the argument against the argument was also making a point about who the current system was designed for, the way that the absence of a leave entitlement was not a neutral policy, but a policy that reflected a set of assumptions about what workers' lives looked like, assumptions that were accurate for some workers and deeply inaccurate for others. Clinton signs the bill on February 5, 1993, 11 days after his inauguration. The signing is quick in the sense that it happens early in the administration, reflecting the priority that had been given to the legislation during the campaign. The bill has been in Congress in various forms for 8 years. The 8 years of debate are visible in the specifics of what the final law does and does not do. The law provides 12 weeks of unpaid leave for eligible employees at covered employers for specified family and medical reasons. The leave is unpaid. The employer is required to maintain health benefits during the leave and to reinstate the employee to the same or equivalent position upon return. The unpaid provision is significant. It means that the leave is available in law to anyone and available in practice to those who can afford to take 12 weeks without pay, which is not everyone and which is disproportionately not people in the lower income brackets where the need is, in many cases, greatest. The law is real progress in the sense that it establishes a flaw that did not previously exist, a federal entitlement that cannot be contracted away, and that gives employees a legal remedy for violations. The law is limited in the ways that first laws in a new area tend to be limited. It sets the floor, it does not set the ceiling, and the ceiling will need to be raised by subsequent legislation and changing norms and the slow accumulation of enforcement and precedent. You read about the signing in the newspaper and you think about the women in your training cohort from 1984, the 14 women out of 40 analysts who sat in the conference room on the 22nd floor. You think about where they are 9 years later. You know where some of them are. Some of them are at the firm still at various levels. Some of them have left for other firms or boutiques or consulting or academia. Some of them have left the industry. The attrition rate among the women is higher than the attrition rate among the men, and the attrition is not random. It clusters in the years following the events that the FMLA is now addressing, the years around pregnancy and leave and the return to work in an institution that has been adjusting in your absence. The law comes 12 weeks after Clinton's inauguration. For some of the women in that cohort, it comes several years too late to change what changed. The 1980s ended and the early 1990s arrived, and the numbers at the top of the financial industry's institutions were still not what they should have been, given the numbers that had entered at the bottom a decade earlier. The math was simple, and the conclusion it pointed to was not comfortable. Something had happened in the middle of the pipeline. Something had filtered women out, or slowed them down, or convinced them to leave, or held them in place while the institution moved around them. The Mommy Track article had named the pattern in 1989. The naming had not eliminated it. Naming things rarely eliminates them immediately. It makes them visible, and visibility is the necessary precondition for change, but it is not change itself. The economic recession of the early 1990s added complications that were not specific to women, but that affected women in specific ways. The downsizing that swept through financial services in 1990 and 1991 reduced headcount at firms that had expanded rapidly during the boom years of the mid to late 1980s. When firms downsized, the decisions about who stayed and who left were made by the same people who had been making the decisions about who got which deals and who was introduced to which clients, and those people brought to the downsizing decisions the same frameworks they had brought to everything else. Studies conducted in this period found that women were disproportionately represented among those who were let go in financial industry downsizing. The studies were careful about the methodology, noting that the disproportion could reflect multiple factors, including seniority distributions and the concentration of women in certain roles, but the pattern was consistent enough across multiple institutions and multiple studies to be more than coincidence and less than coincidence. The recession accelerated a filtering process that had been operating more gradually throughout the decade. You were not let go. You were senior enough by 1991 that your position was not in immediate question during the downsizing, and the performance record in your notebook was sufficient protection. You watched colleagues leave. Some of them were women whose trajectories had been similar to yours. Some of them were men who had not been performing well. The downsizing made no formal distinctions on the basis of gender, while producing outcomes that reflected the gendered structure of the institution. The survivors were not randomly selected from the population. They were selected by people with frameworks, and the frameworks had histories. In November of 1993, you were promoted to vice president. The promotion came at the same review cycle in which 2 other senior associates were promoted, both male, both with tenures comparable to yours. It came 2.5 years later than it should have come, by the objective measure of your performance relative to your peers' performance and the timelines your male peers had experienced. It came 5 years after your pregnancy announcement, after 2.5 years of documentation and careful internal advocacy and conversations with Martin that were always vague and never resulted in a specific commitment, and then, suddenly, in November of 1993, resulted in a promotion. The promotion is real. You received it in a meeting with Martin, who said the right things, and this time the right things had the right outcome, and you walked out of his office as a vice president, and you called Diane in Connecticut that evening, and she said finally in a tone of voice that contained several years of complicated feelings about this word and this institution, and this particular November. The promotion does not unmake the years that preceded it. It does not restore the Anderson deal or the Carlyle-client relationship or the December cycle that produce promotions for other people and not for you. What it does is confirm that the trajectory can be restored, that the bending of it was not permanent, that the combination of documentation and performance and changed external landscape and the accumulation of time produced, eventually, a different decision. You told the dinner group 2 weeks later. Ellen, who has also been promoted at her firm, sent flowers. Margaret, who left her institution and is now at a smaller advisory firm where she describes the culture as genuinely different, in ways she's still assessing, sent a card that said simply about time. Patricia, who is now navigating her own version of the calculation from the position of someone who has more information about what she's navigating than any of you had going in, sent a note that said she was inspired by you, which is a word you received with some ambivalence, because inspiration is a category that individualizes what is structural, that makes a story about a system into a story about a person's perseverance, and the story is about both, and neither framing is complete. The decade that ended in 1989 produced extraordinary opportunities for the women who entered finance during it. The opportunities were real. The doors were opening in ways they had not been opened before, and the opening was genuinely significant. The decade also produced a set of informal institutional practices that filtered and slowed and discouraged a significant number of women who had every credential and every capacity, and who ran into a wall that was not visible from the outside and not acknowledges from the inside, and that operated, as the most effective forms of discrimination always operate, through a pattern of deniable individual decisions rather than through any single identifiable act. The conversation about this pattern, which was made harder by the absence of a name for it until 1989, was made easier by the naming, and has been made easier still by the accumulation of cases and studies, and the passage of the FMLA, and the generational experience of women who went through the wall and came out the other side with something to say about what the wall is made of. The conversation is not over. The pattern is not over. The women entering the training programs of the early 1990s will encounter versions of the same pattern, somewhat modified by the changed legal and cultural landscape, but recognizable to anyone who has been paying attention. What is different and what matters is that the pattern is more visible, more discussable, more likely to be named when it occurs and to be named accurately, rather than attributed to individual failings of commitment or performance. The notebook is a response to the pattern. The dinner is a response to the pattern. The employment lawyer's office is a response to the pattern. The response is imperfect and individual, and does not address the pattern at the structural level at which it operates. But the response exists, and the existence of the response changes the pattern's relationship to the people it operates against, gives them a way of standing in relation to it that is different from the relationship of people who cannot see what is happening to them. Your son will work someday in some institution, in some version of the world that your generation is shaping right now, in this decade, through the decisions made and not made in offices on floors where the carpet is burgundy, and the glow of the screens is amber and the phones ring continuously in the particular register of things that require immediate response. The world he works in will not be the world his father works in, or the world you work in. It will be something else, something still forming, something that the decades' conversations and decisions and cases and articles and dinners and notebooks are contributing to without controlling. What you have to give him from inside the specific situation of being the specific woman who came off the elevator in the navy suit in 1984 and is still here in 1993 with the VP title and the notebook and the dinner group and the clarity about what happened and the forward motion that is still, despite everything, forward motion is the witness. The careful, specific, documented witness. The refusal to let the pattern dissolve into the atmosphere where it cannot be named or addressed. The insistence that the thing that happened is real and describable and worth describing, even when the describing is difficult and even when the audience for the description is sometimes unwilling, and even when the outcomes of the describing are uncertain. You are still here. The floor hums, the phones ring, the amber glows. You are still here, and you are still doing the work, and the work is still extraordinary, and you know more about the world you're working in than you did when you arrived, and the knowing is worth more than the cost of how you came to know it. This is what you can say. This is what is true. What does it mean to have succeeded in a system that was structured against you? This question does not have a simple answer, and it has a different answer depending on what you mean by succeeded and what you mean by structured and what you consider the relevant comparison. If succeeded means reaching the VP title at a major investment bank, then you have succeeded, and the reaching of it was harder than it should have been and took longer than it should have taken, but it was reached. If succeeded means having done so without cost, then the question is moot. There was cost. The cost was real. The cost is in the notebook. The women who came before you, the women who entered finance in the 1970s in the first wave of meaningful female participation, have a different vantage point on the decade you inhabited. They were the ones who walked into rooms where no woman had walked before, who sat at tables where the expectation of their presence had to be created from scratch. Their experience was harder in some ways and simpler in others, simpler in the sense that the overt hostility, when it was present, was at least legible, could at least be named clearly. The pattern you experienced was subtler and more deniable, and in some ways harder to address precisely because of its subtlety. The women who will come after you, who are entering the training programs of the mid-1990s, will have a different experience again. The legal landscape will be clearer for them, the institutional practices more scrutinized, the conversation about what is acceptable more developed. They will still encounter versions of the pattern, but they will encounter them with more vocabulary for describing them, more precedent for addressing them, more evidence that the pattern has been named and contested, and that the naming and the contesting have made a difference. You are part of the evidence. Your notebook, even if it never enters any formal proceeding, is evidence. The clarity you have produced, the witness you have been to your own experience, is evidence. It passes forward in ways that are not always traceable, but that are real. The recession of 1990 and 1991 changes the floor in ways that are separate from the pattern you have been documenting, and that interact with it in ways that are complicated to disentangle. The layoffs come in waves. The first wave in the autumn of 1990 affects primarily the most junior staff and the people in the groups that are losing business as deal flow contracts. The second wave, in the spring of 1991, reaches further up. People with 5 and 6 years at the firm receive their calls. People who thought they were past the vulnerable years discover that the vulnerable years extend further than they had understood. The recession layoffs are not discriminatory in the technical sense. People are laid off on the basis of criteria that are, when stated, neutral: performance, group profitability, headcount targets. The criteria are neutral, and the application of the criteria is not random, and the non-randomness follows patterns that are familiar if you have been paying attention. The people whose deal flow had been reduced in the months before the layoffs have less to show in their performance files. The people whose client relationships had been quietly absorbed by colleagues are less connected to the revenue that protects positions. The informal adjustments of the previous years have become, in the recession, formal vulnerabilities. You survive both waves. You survive them because your performance file is strong, and because you have been meticulous about maintaining the documentation of your contributions, and because the deals you closed in the years before the recession are on the record in ways that are not easily erased. You survive them also because you made decisions, in the years after your return from leave, about where to concentrate your energy, decisions about which relationships to deepen and which deals to position yourself for, that were informed by the pattern you had been observing, and that turned out to be the right decisions given what the recession would reveal about which positions were structurally protected. The vice president promotion comes in November of 1993, 9 months after the FMLA signing. It is 2.5 years later than it would have been if the trajectory you were on before your pregnancy had continued without interruption. You know this not as an estimate but as a calculation, because you have been tracking the promotions of your cohort with the specificity of someone who has reason to track them. The men who were your direct peers in the training program, the ones with equivalent or slightly lower performance in the early years, were promoted to vice president in the spring of 1991 during the recession, when the firm was simultaneously laying people off and promoting people from within. You were passed over in that cycle. The official explanation was timing. The dinner group has its November meeting the week after your promotion is announced. The responses are warm and specific and also, beneath the warmth, calibrated in the way that the responses of people who have been watching a pattern for years are calibrated. Ellen is glad. Ellen is also noting what the timeline means. Margaret, who is still at Morgan Stanley and who received her own vice president promotion the previous spring, notes that you are both running approximately the same number of years behind where you would have been if the pattern had not intervened. Patricia has settled her case. The settlement was sealed. She is now at a different firm and doing well, and she speaks about the settlement only obliquely, in ways that tell you the outlines without telling you the specifics. What the decade produced is something that is difficult to characterize in a single way, because it produced several things simultaneously that do not reduce to a single story. It produced a cohort of women who entered these institutions with genuine credentials and genuine ambitions and who navigated, with varying degrees of success, a system that was adjusting to their presence without fully accommodating it. Some of them are still in the industry, some are not. The ones who stayed are mostly at levels that are 2 to 5 years behind where they would have been absent, the patterns documented in notebooks in the evenings after children were asleep. The gap is real. The gap is also not the whole story, because they stayed, and they did the work, and the work was real, and what they built in these years is real, and the gap and the real thing both belong to the decade together. You get home on the night the promotion is announced and your son is asleep and the apartment is quiet in the specific way that the apartment is quiet after he goes to sleep. The way the city continues outside, but the interior has a different quality of stillness. You put your briefcase down. You sit at the kitchen table. The navy blue notebook is on the shelf in the hallway. It is full. You have not opened it in months. There will be a new notebook if it becomes necessary, but the pattern has shifted since the FMLA, and since the promotion, and since the accumulation of the years of documentation that established, in ways that cannot be revised, what you did and what was done and what the distance between the two produced. You sit at the table for a while in the quiet. It is late, and you are tired, and you have been working for a very long time. The city is outside. Your son is asleep. You will go to sleep. Tomorrow the floor will open at 9. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. Let this settle now. Let the details go soft at the edges. The burgundy carpet on the 43rd floor, the amber glow of the Quatron, the navy suit hanging in the closet, the notebook at home, growing thicker. Let them dissolve into the general shape of what they were, which is a world that existed and was real, and that a generation of women inhabited with the same intelligence and the same ambition and the same hope that they had brought to everything that came before it. The women on those trading floors did not leave a monument. There is no building named for them. There is no landmark where the Tuesday morning conversation with Martin happened. No plaque on the restaurant on the Upper East Side where the dinner group met every 6 weeks. What they left is harder to see than a monument and in some ways more durable. They left a changed set of expectations. They left a map of the interior of the institution, annotated with everything that was not on the official floor plan. They left daughters and colleagues and successors who entered similar institutions with more information than they had possessed, which is the most practical form of legacy that a person in a difficult situation can produce. The city outside the window on the 43rd floor is still there. The financial towers are still there, larger now and more various. The people inside them more various too. The Quatron replaced by screens that are faster and brighter, and that show a world of markets more complex than anyone imagined in 1984. The burgundy carpet has been replaced. The walnut panelling on most floors has been replaced with something that is supposed to project innovation rather than permanence. The suits that the women wear on those floors now are somewhat freer, somewhat less laboured over, somewhat less required to carry the burden of argument. The patterns have not been eliminated. It would be incorrect to say that the mommy track no longer exists in 2024, or that the small deniable decisions have stopped being made, or that the notebook would have nothing in it for a woman who started keeping one today. But the patterns exist in a more visible landscape, in a world where the conversation is more available, where the law has more teeth, where the accumulation of decades of women's documentation and advocacy has produced an external environment that is harder to ignore. Let the lights of the city go soft now. Let the sound of the trading floor, that steady hum that you feel more than hear, like the vibration of a very large machine, let it fade. Let the elevator doors close. Let the 43rd floor recede. The women who stood in that lobby are somewhere in the city tonight, or in houses in Connecticut, or in smaller firms, or in second careers, or in retirement, or in none of those places. They are where their lives took them, which is where everyone ends up. The night is quiet. Your briefcase is on the chair by the door where you always put it. The suit is dry cleaned and hanging in the closet ready for morning. Your son is asleep in the next room, growing at the imperceptible pace of children at rest, accumulating what he needs to become whoever he will be. The city outside the window is doing its soft late-night thing, a sound more felt than heard. The calculation continues. The calculation always continues. But not tonight. Tonight the numbers can wait. Tonight the deals are closed and the clients are asleep and the notebook is on the shelf. Tonight is for sleeping. Let yourself go down now, slowly. The way the elevator descends, floor by floor, the numbers decreasing on the panel, each one another small release, until you have left the upper floors entirely, and you are resting in the quiet place below everything, where the work does not reach, and the pattern has no meaning, and there is only the dark and the warmth and the sound of your own breathing, slow and even, carrying you gently through the night. If you like this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments. What chapter of history do you want to sleep inside next? The floor of a major investment bank is never quiet. Even now, even in the years after the decade you have been inside, even after the patterns you have documented and the law that has been passed, and the promotions that have finally arrived, and the women who have left and the women who have stayed, the floor is not quiet. The Quatron terminals have been replaced by Bloomberg terminals, which are faster and more information dense, and which glow a different colour, but the function is the same, to make the current state of the world visible in numbers in real time without sentiment. You think about this sometimes on the subway downtown in the early morning, in the years after the vice president promotion, in the years that are still going and that have not yet resolved into the clarity that memory imposes on completed things. You think about what you knew at 26 and what you did not know, and how the not knowing was not ignorance but simply the state of being at the beginning of something, which is what 26 years old is. You knew you were good at this work. You knew the work was difficult and consequential, and that doing it well was something you were capable of, and something that mattered. You did not know the structure of the story you were inside, because you were at the beginning of it, and the structure of a story is only visible from a sufficient distance. The navy suit is still in your closet, not the original. That one wore out in the 5th year, the seams finally giving way along the lines that had been stressed the most, which is where seams always give way. But there is still a navy suit. There is always still a navy suit. You put it on in the mornings with the ease of someone who has been putting on the same garment for a long time, and who no longer has to think about whether it fits. It fits. It has always fit. The question was never whether the suit was right. The question was whether the suit would be enough. And the answer to that question took a decade to arrive at, and required more documentation than it should have, and arrived later than it should have arrived. What you know now, that you did not know standing in the elevator lobby in 1984, is that the story you were inside was not only your story. It was the story of your cohort and of the women who came before you, and of the women who came after you, and of the institutions that were changing slowly and in their own time, and at a pace that was set by their own internal logic, and not by the urgency of the people inside them waiting for the change. The story is still going. The numbers are better. The numbers are not yet right. The distance between better and right is the space where the work continues,